All right, everyone. Looks like we are finally live. The day has arrived. The moment we've all been waiting for here on the Jefferson Lee channel. The return of Jay Dyer. The last time Jay and I spoke, we kind of did a pre-recorded audio podcast. But now that my channel finally has had at least one of its strikes removed, I can now finally live stream again. I figured one of the best guests we could have to kick off the streaming on the main channel would be Jay. Jay, how you doing today, bro?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks for having me back. We had an excellent conversation last time. It was pretty much all positive reviews, so I'm glad to be back.
I'm happy to have you. And I say we just kind of kick right into it. I mean, people obviously will come into the stream as they get the notification, but you and I were talking a little bit before we went live about libertarianism, Americanism, and I noticed a couple weeks ago, and this is actually perfect timing because I was getting a lot of feedback from a stream that I did last week by people who are perhaps alt-right or, race realists, and they want to have, say, a white majority in America or in Europe or whatever, but they were pushing back against my criticisms of Americanism. They were pushing back against my criticisms against classical liberalism and saying, well, pretty much pigeonholing me as a bad guy for saying I might prefer some type of monarchistic system to what we have now. Mm-hmm. And you've really kind of been first and foremost, at least for me, in discussing alternatives to liberalism. So I was wondering, people always ask me, what's the best solution we could have? How do we move forward from here? So I say we kick right into it. What are the problems with liberalism? What are the problems with libertarianism, which I think is often falsely looked at as a solution to liberalism, which is foolish? And how can we find a better way out of the present day system the West is in?
Yeah, great questions. Well, let's start with the positives from libertarianism so that we don't get the wrong impression as if I think that everything in the ideology or all of its thinkers are wrong. They're not. I also don't claim to be an expert on libertarianism. I was very into it for several years. I read a lot of the libertarian thinkers and philosophers and economists. So I'm not speaking from ignorance, but I also eventually came to see a lot of weaknesses in the system. So the first thing I would say is that liberty is true. It does exist. It is real. But one of the problems with libertarianism is that it has a tendency to define the role of the state or the role of law as negative. Okay, so this is known in political history as negative liberty. This is the idea that the role of the state is really as an institution to have a minimal role, right? So it might protect the border, it might protect trade so that you can have commerce, blah, blah, blah. But it really has to have this is the minarchist type position. Okay, well, the problem is that, again, if you know the history of the West and the rise of libertarianism and the ideas of, quote, liberty, then I think you can't really divorce it from the course of Western thought and philosophy, right? The milieu from which these ideas come historically, namely the revolutions. So I won't rehearse all that because we talked about that in the last interview that we did. So if people want to hear more about the revolutionary tradition, they can go to that. But just in terms of political theory, my critique is that whether it's ethics, whether it's how we know things, or whether it's a question of what's real, which is the three branches of philosophy, the libertarian ethos arises out of a secular ethos. It arises out of an atheistic ethos. So that's the first starting point of where I would want to critique them. And I would say that my view, which also I believe has a place for liberty and accurately can define liberty and its limits, makes more sense than a position which starts with the assumption that there's such a thing as liberty and then tries to define it by some kind of role of the state or some kind of natural rights philosophy, all of which I think ultimately collapse into themselves and fail. So you need much more than generic slogans and ideas, all of which, again, come out of the French Revolution or spirit of 1776, something like this. Liberty, equality, fraternity. This is the rallying cry of both 1789 and 1776, and they're not true. Okay, so if they're not true, then we need more than revolutionary slogans. We actually need an entire ethos, an entire paradigm, an entire worldview from which to approach not just a question of what liberty is, how do we know we have it, but also the questions that liberty presupposes, like what is this being that has liberty? Well, you're talking about man. You're talking about a being that you think has dignity and rights and has free will, has volition to exercise that liberty. And that presupposes something like personhood. That presupposes the idea that, in my view, you're made in the image of God, and that's why you have dignity. If you're just a phenomenon of nature, you don't really have dignity. Really, all you have is some sort of Hobbesian kind of rule of nature, law of the jungle, something like this. Social contract theory, the other ideas that were proposed to try to make sense of how we can have law. I think all of those collapse and fail precisely because the Enlightenment itself collapses and fails. So the right, and what you're calling alt-right, is correct in their critique of the Enlightenment and the libertarian ethos. And I myself kind of went down that road at one time where I had a very, I wouldn't say I was ever a fascist, but I was open to and read what we might call the first, second, and third positions, right? So sometimes in political philosophy, the 20th century, you have the classification of the three positions, right? Which would be like democratic / capitalist type views. You would have socialism, Marxism, and then fascism. So these are the three positions. And I would say that all three of them share, just like libertarianism, we might class it under the same as democracy or capitalism. They all share the same assumptions of secularism, of naturalism, of atheism, most of the time empiricism. And that tends to bring with it its own metaphysic, even though a lot of these positions think that they're anti-metaphysical. They're not worried about metaphysics. They actually do have metaphysical assumptions. I have a whole essay on this about libertarian economics and their metaphysics. So long story short is just that negative liberty is not enough. We need a more holistic philosophy, a more holistic paradigm. And what we get when we try to erect societies based on purely negative liberty is the American experiment, or we get something like French Revolution, or we get some aberration that within a few centuries has turned into something monstrous.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a very tough pill for a lot of people to swallow. I was training before I was working out, and I was kind of mentally preparing for our interview today while I was in between sets or whatever, and I was thinking a lot about the left versus the right in American political conflict. And I don't deny that there should be, perhaps in a more reasonably structured society, a healthy tension between a conservative movement that is trying to preserve traditions, preserve society, and a liberal, I'll say liberal, but I don't really mean it in the classical sense, or a progressive, but still not meant in that sense, some component of society that's trying to adopt new traditions and push your society forward with technological advancements, in the modern world. Mm-hmm. But I think where I have really started to withdraw from American political discourse is that conservatism is fundamental. American conservatism is fundamentally just trying to preserve what is actually a revolutionary ethos.
Correct. Absolutely.
And they don't seem to, I could understand the desire for the average American to say, I want things to be like the way they were in the 1960s, because I think maybe it was a little bit better back then, but still it's we cannot remove the fact that what happened in the 60s led to where we are at right now. And absolutely. Being someone who, people call me alt-right, I don't run from that classification, but I think it's a broad umbrella, and it's very, very difficult to describe what that really means. One of the criticisms I had of people who are in the alt-right is that they are kind of advocating for Americanism plus racism. Mm-hmm. And they're not really getting into serious criticisms of this system and how it got us in all this trouble to begin with.
Correct. Yeah. One of the things that usually occurs is on that side is the argument that, well, you're never going to convince Americans of anti-Americanism. And yeah, really, I mean, but that's not that really has nothing to do with whether Americanism is true or a consistent philosophy or geopolitical paradigm to hold to. So those are two different questions. And first thing I would say is that a lot of people, nobody would have thought that Christianity would have permeated the Roman Empire and eventually converted it to the longest lasting empire in the world in world history, but it did. You have the conversion of the empire to the Orthodox Imperium, and I think that's a great testament to the reality and the history of what I'm getting at, the fact that the church historically ordained kings in coronation ceremonies. This reflected the hierarchy that was seen to be in the universe itself, with the angelic hierarchy, the hierarchy of the church, with the ecclesiastical hierarchy. And then you have the double-headed Byzantine eagle, the church, which is supposed to work in symphonia with the state. So the point being that I think unquestionably is there's no doubt that is the traditional Christian view, despite how many Protestant heretics and modernists deny that. That is it's just a freaking fact. And even whether anybody wants it to be true or not, you have all these ecumenical councils. You have, the Seventh Council referring to the emperor as the God-ordained imperium. And so, we can speak of European man. Yes, in a way, his soul, his spirit informs Christianity when he converts to create Christendom. And I don't see why that's necessarily. I don't see anything wrong with that. However, this kind of dialogue and debate that we're having, it may seem new to us, but really the older I get, the more I learn. These dialogues and debates have already been happening. In fact, I was just reading a Russian statesman, a philosopher from the 1890s. His name is Konstantin Pobyedonossev. That's a very long, confusing name. But in 1898, he wrote a book about it's called Reflections of a Russian Statesman. And in this book, he's writing about the Byzantine theory, the Byzantine view, which, traditionally Russia continued on that tradition of church and state relationships. And he's writing against the Western democratic Enlightenment libertarian ethos. And he's critiquing it in a very profound, solid way, I would say. I mean, within the first chapter, he points out that, look, I'm just giving this as an example. He says, look, every society needs religious belief. Yeah. And so he says, ironically, even if you don't believe in religion, it still is the norm in all of human history that societies have a religion. So he's basically just saying, even if you thought that religion wasn't true, it still makes sense that the social order has some kind of binding religious force. And he says that any time that the church or the state have tried to alter this relationship that was the norm for the imperium, what you get is these weird aberrations. And he says something to the effect of, so the quote is that he says, anytime that you divide the church from the state will run the church. So basically you're going to get some kind of state controlled religion, which is ironic because oftentimes, constant criticism of Orthodoxy. Oh, you have Caesaro-papism. You have the Caesar is the Pope of the church. Well, of course, that's not actually true, because if it was, there would not be many heretical emperors. There would not be many martyrs in the church who were actually put to death by heretical emperors. And the church would have been turned into a heresy machine a long time ago following one of the heretical emperors. But in fact, it hasn't. So the fact that the faith sustains a people, even in the midst of these things, in the midst of these historic controversies, shows that, in fact, what most people think is that the religion is in a society is based on the state. Actually, the other way around is what's true. The state needs the religious faith. The state is based on the faith. And anytime the state casts it off, the state will soon wither and die. It may even turn into an atheistic, persecuting Bolshevik type faith. But that no longer exists. That has died, or at least it no longer exists in Russia. It's being set up in America, apparently. But point being is that harmony and symphonia between these two spheres we could speak about is something that was not invented by European man, but adopted by European man from the heritage of Scripture. You get this taught in the Old Testament. You get this taught in the book of Zechariah, where there's two lampstands, church and state, spoken of very clearly in Zechariah. And the church has always believed this. And what I'm getting at is that it wasn't like the only options that we had after 1600 in the West. Unfortunately, it may have been the only options in the West, but after 1600, 1700 in the West, the options become, well, you're either Roman Catholic or you're a Protestant. If you're Roman Catholic, ironically, you still do kind of have the remnants of, you were supposed to have the remnants of the same view that the church, that the state should be confessional. And every state, whether it wants to or not, will be confessional. This is the big secret. There are no secular states. There are states that claim to be secular, but in fact, they get run by secret shadow groups. And the people who believe in secularism or the secular state, they actually have a dogmatic faith commitment to it to such a degree that eventually, guess what? They end up promoting abortion. They end up promoting genocide. They end up promoting wars in a religious way, right? So it's all a facade. And I think that even just regular statesmen in Russia in the 1890s could see this. They could see that the revolutions that were being promoted, and by the way, he's writing this prior to 1917, so prior to the Russian Revolution, and he just like Dostoevsky and many others foresaw that these revolutions would in fact just lead to bloodshed and chaos because they can't produce the thing that they intend to produce because they cut themselves off from the spiritual source. So I know I'm rambling, but to make one last final point, the problem with taking the sort of neo-pagan, we might call it, route to how you would view the Imperium or the Empire, which, for example, I've read all of Yaki's Imperium many years ago. And there's a lot of insights in Yaki's Imperium, but one of the things that is problematic is that it does fall back into this kind of Nietzschean Darwin type approach. And although I doubt Yaki would say he's a strict biological determinist, what we're doing is we're trying to revert back to a kind of will to power position. But the problem with the will to power position is that it's really, in essence, no different than the liberal Imperium position, because it doesn't really matter whether you are a technocrat who believes that everybody should be depopulated or whether you're Nietzsche and you think that you should rule and everybody should be depopulated. I mean, they're essentially, they fall back into being the same positions, and they don't believe in the dignity of man. They don't believe that the state has a duty to God. What you get in the Imperium is the deification of the state. So ironically, I would argue, as I've argued many times, as counterintuitive and absurd as it may sound, I actually do believe that libertarianism is most fully expounded in a traditional monarchy society.
That's a great point, and I think even Hans Hermann Hoppe has kind of mirrored that a little, which is funny because some libertarians don't want to accept that, and you have this idea that even amongst libertarians, which is very disturbing in a sense, that like that Francis Fukuyama was correct and that liberal democracy was the end of history, right? Like that this was the premier type of the apex of governance, and we can't really kind of come past that. And ironically, Fukuyama's actually walked that back quite a bit over the past couple of years as he sees the world changing. But there was something you touched on there that I think I would really want to hear you extrapolate upon this a little bit more. And I want to kind of inject my own personal experiences into this. So I was raised Catholic. I went to Catholic high school and eventually turned into an atheist. And now I find myself moving away from that, as we kind of discussed last time. And I'm reading your works on Orthodoxy, listening to your videos on Orthodoxy, because I do think that Christianity in America is not really what Christianity actually was meant to be. And I could be wrong, but I do feel like, I think even Richard Spencer has said this, and I know Greg Johnson has said this, which is like evangelical Christianity or Protestant Christianity in the West is basically just liberalism with Jesus.
Sure.
And on top of that, I find this is a very fascinating topic. There's a friend of mine, really, really good dude, and he's got to be around 40 years old. So he's like on the cusp between millennial and Gen Xer. And he's has boomer type views, though. Like, he's the type of guy who is ensconced in Republican Party rhetoric, thought Mitt Romney would be good, which is absolutely hilarious. And he and I will debate back and forth on these topics all the time. And he made a comment to me recently that really kind of stuck in my head. Here's a guy who's a Christian, Protestant though, but he's a Christian. Actually, I think he's Episcopalian. And I was talking about the Constitution, and I told him I don't understand the religious worship for what is essentially a legal document.
Mm-hmm.
And you said yourself, humans are inherently religious. They're going to find something, whether it's the Constitution or veganism, as you found out the other day with your debate with Vegan Gains and those other retards. My friend said to me, the Constitution is a timeless document. And I asked him, I was like, how could you be a Christian and then tell me that a legal document is equally as timeless as the Bible? It doesn't make sense. There's a contradiction here. And I told him, I really feel like the separation of church and state, which we're told in school is this great thing, this great achievement of the founding fathers, this great achievement of the Enlightenment, is actually pretty disastrous.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is why very soon we're going to be doing two different books at Jay's Analysis. We're going to be doing Fire in the Minds of Men, which is the history of the revolutionary faith, written by someone who is a big fan of it, James H. Billington, famous American scholar, head of the Library of Congress. So we're going to be doing that because he discusses all of the influences, the occult and esoteric and Masonic and deistic influences on the founding fathers and their kissing cousins, the Marxist revolutionaries, by the way. And we'll also be doing eventually a Republic of Mind and Spirit, which is the Yale has now put out Catherine Albanese's book on the cultural history of American metaphysical religion. And what is the American metaphysical religion? Well, it's civic religion, the American civic religion, which is essentially what you're getting at, the deification of Washington, of the founding fathers, of the documents, to a quasi-religious status. And it's very fascinating, this phenomenon. I think it really began with the Puritans, but there's no doubt about it. In fact, I mean, I grew up as a Baptist and then had several years where I was a Calvinist, went to a Calvinist seminary, Protestant seminary. So I know deep down the essence of the idea of the American Republic being essentially a kind of stand-in replacement church for, it's the city on a hill. It's the mystical body of George Washington or something, some kind of weird version of church, civic religion. But if you've ever seen the painting, this is best embodied in the Apotheosis of Washington. Have you seen that painting?
I don't. If I have, I'm not aware that the name is the Apotheosis of Washington.
Oh yeah, that's the name of it. It's a famous painting of George Washington. Is basically doing the Baphomet pose of as above, so below, and he's painted like he's this god. I mean, it's the essence of the American civic religion. All of DC is a giant, homage to Masonry and deism. So this idea that there's not a philosophical religious commitment on the part of the American founding documents is absurd. And this itself illustrates the absurdity of it, which is the fundamental nonsense of, on the one hand, the rights are grounded in God, and yet at the same time, this God essentially has nothing to say about us and he reveals nothing about himself in these documents. He's a contentless God. The contentless God that only gives you supposedly natural rights is the God of Masonry. That's not an actual God that you know or have a relationship with. It's certainly not the God of traditional Christianity. And the fact that, Masonry and Christianity have been at odds for centuries should show that. I mean, it's just fundamentally a different philosophy, different worldview. So the idea that somehow, I mean, it's almost like the earliest versions of ecumenism, like somehow we can build a society together with, people who are Satanists like Ben Franklin, but Episcopalians like half the other founding fathers, and then a few Baptists and sprinkle in a few Catholics. I mean, it's ludicrous. And why? Well, we'll just base it on these generic Enlightenment principles. Well, but the problem is that over time, people start to notice the contradictions within the claims, such as the idea that all men are created equal. Well, they're not. All men are created equal. Sorry. And everybody knows this.
Yes.
Now, you could say that all men share rights and have certain aspects to their person that give them dignity, but that requires more than just saying that we have a creator. Because I mean, what if I think that creator? I was talking to a guy today, in fact, a person who was engaging me in a religious discussion, and he said something to the effect of, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, well, you know, I used to hang out with this Roman Catholic priest, and we would get together with some other religious people, and we would have these conversations. And he said, what I finally came to realize is that we all just believe in one God. And I said, yeah, but I said that you realize that's not Christianity, right? He's like, well, but don't you think we all just kind of believe in one God? I mean, shouldn't we start there? I said, well, okay. I said, what if I believe that one God is Satan? And he kind of froze, and he was like, it's like, so I was like, so that's why you can't just start with like a generic masonry. Like it doesn't make any sense. And that's unfortunately the unthought out assumptions of the American founding fathers, is the idea that we could erect a society that was, on the one hand, somehow loosely religious and guarded certain rights, but also at the same time secular. So there's a fundamental double think. And even if you disagree with me, I don't see how a person can't at least see that that's true. Like you can't. I mean, for example, let's say half of these founding fathers believe that God demands that you keep the Sabbath, right? They had a lot of Puritans that thought you had to keep the Sabbath. Well, then a bunch of other deists don't think it matters at all. Now, does this God, this contentless God of the founding documents, does he mandate that everybody keep the Sabbath or not? Now, if you believe that he does, then everybody's supposed to keep the Sabbath, even the deists. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
What about abortion? Same type of issue. What about, gay marriage, homosexuality? These are obvious examples of where the absurdity of the idea of a secular society breaks down. You can't have it. You can't have a Muslim, a Jehovah's Witness, an Orthodox Christian, a Roman Catholic, and a Satanist all coming together to create a harmonious society. It's ludicrous. It's retarded. And anybody with an IQ should easily be able to figure that out, because they're contradictory claims. Now, again, doesn't mean that I'm proven right by that fact, but we should all at least be able to admit that we can't concoct a Freemasonic society just on the basis of the idea that there might be one creator.
Yeah, you did a podcast months ago with the guys from Arctos Media. Mm-hmm. And I started following the Arctos guys, and I was talking to them on Twitter, and I asked, hey, what are some political theory books that you could suggest for someone like myself who's just kind of, getting off the libertarian plantation that's looking for something different? And right away, one of the guys suggested, hey, read some Carl Schmitt. And so I bought the Carl Schmitt book, Concept of the Political. And I do think that Schmitt's analysis, at the very least, of liberalism versus kind of traditional European societies prior to the Enlightenment was very interesting. And there are a lot of people out here, you'll see guys like a Jared Taylor or something that will say, like, we're in the trouble that we're in because the founding fathers, they didn't really mean it. They didn't really mean that a multiracial society or multicultural society would be successful. In their own personal writings, they perhaps express something entirely different. But Schmitt, I think, was correct in his criticism, which was the concept of a state that encompassed not just the laws or the political arm of the state, but also the religion, which downstream is a uniform morality for all of its people, was probably in many respects necessary for the survival of the people in that area. And when you think about the present day state of the United States, and there are so many conservatives, this really drives me crazy, that will make fun of France or Germany. And don't get me wrong, they're not doing well over there either, and I get it. Well, acting like things are somehow better here, without understanding that, like, if you're coming at this from a pro-white perspective, we're actually worse off demographically. But the country here is big enough that people can flee to certain areas and not really see the fallout from all the awful political decisions that we've had that I think descend from the founding tradition in many respects. But what's ironic is Eastern and Central Europe into Russia, because they were weirdly shielded from liberalism, are actually doing better. And we like to think, oh man, these people who were behind the Iron Curtain, they had it so rough. And I'm not saying that it was good to be there. I'm not saying that it was fun to be under the thumb of the NKVD or whatever. But ironically, demographically and culturally, a lot of these countries that made up the Eastern Bloc, or the Warsaw Pact or whatever, are doing better because they were not injected with liberalism the way so many of us were following 1945.
Yeah, correct. I mean, I was just looking again at some of the propaganda from FDR and the idea of the four freedoms and all this, and how America would be the universal police force to guard the four freedoms, Team America type bullshit. And yeah, I mean, and the irony is that even though at that time it didn't mean, turning kids into the opposite gender and, transifying the world, guess what? That's what it means now. So, what better example of what I'm trying to get at than the fact that the Fortune 100, the Fortune 500 promotes this across the globe? That is Americanism. Sorry, but it is, because there's no logical reason why, quote, Americanism can't mean the Satanism of Ben Franklin and cutting off kids' genitals, as opposed to the high church Anglican Episcopalianism of one of the other founding fathers. There's no logical. It can mean anything and everything. And that's because it's grounded in a contradictory Enlightenment view. It's grounded in the idea that you could universalize human nature on the one hand to say that everyone is created equal to such a degree that you actually believe in the revolutionary tradition that man's who man is purely formed by externals, right? So you have on the one hand this kind of extreme behaviorist view that would eventually be adopted by people like Auguste Comte and people in the sociological, psychological tradition, the behaviorists, the Skinners, the Pavlovs, the J.B. Watsons. They would follow that trek of revolutionary thought, and they are in that tradition, right? This is how we can say, well, the Enlightenment is going to release the economic prosperity that will raise up everyone. We're going to raise up the entire globe. This is why Kant can write his essay about world government being established so that the market will basically bring world peace. Now, the problem is that the market doesn't have these abilities. The market can't do that, and the market doesn't do that. There's a lot of interesting theory in libertarianism about what the market could and should do, but when you understand elite banking, when you understand shadow banking, shadow governments, then you understand that the ideals of libertarian economic theory collapse. They don't work because they don't take into account cryptocracy. They don't take into account, shadow banking. All that stuff is lost on most libertarians. Now, why do I say all that? Well, because again, the Enlightenment universalization of what human nature is assumes that everybody can be educated through externals, right? It's all external issues. Just have the right social environment by which you can tweak man and quote raise him up and socialize him, and this becomes the socialist tradition of the revolution. Now, other people figure out that man is not just a creature of environment; he's also a creature of DNA, genetics, lineage, heritage. Right? These go into informing what he is, and in fact, an argument can be made that more so. I think even Jared Taylor has said 60-40. I think that's probably true.
Yeah, I agree as well.
60% genetics, 40% environment, and then of course epigenetics, sort of cyclically, kind of back and forth relationship between man and his environment. But the other side, or that there's another side, another school that has thought that man is essentially a completely genetically determined being. So you get these radical eugenicists, you get the radical sort of eventually transhumanist types who think that all of man's ills can be solved by tweaking his physicality. So what it amounts to is two physicalist schools basically bantering over the way to fix man by externals or by altering his DNA, his RNA or whatever. And both of those are really just again, atheistic, materialistic assumptions. They don't deal with man from the starting point, from the assumption that man has a soul, that he's a spiritual being as well. And essentially all my approach is very simple. It's that all atheistic approaches to any of these questions collapse immediately, and they fail just as much as every atheist fails in a debate with me, not because I'm so smart, but precisely because atheism is that foolish.
Yeah, there's two things I want to touch on there. The first thing is, I'm a big fan of JF, so I don't want to make this like an anti-JF thing, because I like what JF does. But when I watched your debate, we touched on this a little bit last time we spoke. When I watched your debate on theism with JF, one of the things that I found was very interesting about your approach to proving God's existence per se, was that it was radically different than what the mainstream media pushes on you. So sure. I'm 32 years old, and I remember in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, you go on YouTube or whatever, and you see Richard Dawkins debating like the goofiest evangelicals, yes, who don't seem to have very convincing arguments
and people like that.
Yeah, and it's almost doing it's not almost, it is without question,
it's a disservice.
I was just going to say it's doing Christianity a tremendous disservice, because the proofs that these people have, proofs of God's existence, are lackluster compared to, say, the evidence that you have produced or the arguments that you've put forward. And I've actually never seen an atheist debate someone who had the kind of philosophical ideology that you have about that. That's the first point. The second point is, this is a little bit different, but this is something that a lot of my subscribers in the past, I think, have had a hard time kind of swallowing, because I used to be a Alex Jones 1776 will commence again type guy. Is that Americanism is the prototypical form of globalism. The concept of a propositional nation, even though that propositional nation was supposed to be made up of whites, even though that propositional nation didn't really tolerate faiths outside Christianity, it was one of the first forms of governance to take the hammer to the traditional form of the nation state and say, well, we could have all different types of Christians in our society, which at that point was kind of unheard of.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember, with so many people being tempted with fascism, is that fascism is part of the revolutionary tradition. Fascism has just as much an atheistic foundation as the other positions do. So let's not be deceived into thinking that it's somehow like mystically or magically more potent. Now, it may in ways be better at constructing like an efficient military or a big war machine or something like that. But again, you need more than that. And by the way, if it was so perfect, as many people seem to think, then why did it lose so easily to the bankers and the internationalists in World War II? I mean, why did the Axis? I mean, I know why, because I've read Tragedy and Hope, but I'm saying that all of the hype that's given to modern neo-fascism and World War II and Axis powers by a lot of the alt-right is kind of laughable when you just look at the simple fact that they didn't win. Now, I think that position, again, so it might have more, it might be better than like, rule by mob, rule by Bolsheviks. Yeah. But again, the problem is that it still can turn into the same brutality. The members, the people who tout this, end up having all the same moral qualms and faults, and end up supporting all the same degeneracy that the people that they were supposedly opposing do, as we've seen a lot of people in the so-called alt-right do. And that's because it's just as atheistic, just as secular, just as pointless. What's the point of all this? We're just going to propound all the same degeneracy. So again, the point of Orthodoxy, the point of Christianity, is that it doesn't just transform the individual, it transforms societies as a whole. And we know that from history. So, again, whether Orthodox countries and nations and people are faithful to that is a different question, because sometimes they're not. Sometimes they fall. They have corrupt priests, they have corrupt leaders, and they fall under oppression. But in fact, that's kind of what God said would happen. He says in Deuteronomy, if you obey, I will subdue your enemies. If you don't, your enemies will subdue you. So you get what you pay for. And I know you probably didn't want to just talk Bible talk, but I mean, for me, I don't see those. There might be people in evangelicalism at times that make interesting arguments or are insightful. I mean, William Lane Craig has some insightful books and stuff, but I don't think I think he's way overrated. He's not that great. And the evangelicals that you mentioned are pretty goofy. And essentially, American evangelicalism is just an atheism factory. That's what I've always said it is. So, one thing that at least Catholicism and Orthodoxy have in their favor is that they have had many philosophers. They've had many thinkers. And so there is a depth there. There is a profundity, mainly because, I mean, even if you just looked at it from history, you've got 2,000 years of people in these traditions thinking about the state, thinking about the church, thinking about this stuff, after Christ came, obviously. I would extend that back into the Old Testament as well with Moses. But, with Protestantism and with evangelicalism, you have basically stupid attempts to reinvent the wheel. And we're, 100, 200, 300 years, 400 years away from whatever Protestant sect people are coming from, having broken away from another Protestant sect and all the way back to breaking off from Rome. And people don't even know where they came from. So we have generations of ignorance. I had to search all this stuff out on my own. I didn't have like some super Orthodox master sending me these books from Russian statesmen from 100 years ago. I mean, this has just been published in English. So I mean, we're not, there's so much that we're not exposed to even that blows my mind. And I'm almost at a loss for words because we aren't even knowledgeable of how ignorant we are, I guess is what I'm trying to say, which is kind of a weird statement, but yeah, America's just a giant mess. And if you look at the fact that, I mean, there's a lot of potentials, there's a lot of good, but I think St. John of Kronstadt said it well when he said that the problem with America is that it is so materially prosperous compared to every other nation in history, that's also its greatest weakness, because that can produce an extremely degenerate, generation, which it's more and more producing just purely materialistic. And now we're moving into the situation where what America produces is actually damaging and harmful to the world and children as a whole, with it pushing this trans nonsense everywhere. And make no mistake about it, it is. Anybody who has any sense about Christianity, about the history of the church and all that has to be opposed to that. There's no doubt about it. There's nothing Christian about it.
There's 2 points that you kind of harped on there that I want to get into. First thing is someone had asked before we went live, hey, can you get Jay to talk about fascism? Of course, it took no jiving. You just kind of delved right into it. I will say that I have some degree, or maybe a significant degree of sympathy for fascism, in the sense that I oftentimes view the fascist movement, back in the early 1900s into the mid 1900s, as some attempt to harken back to a monarchy in the modern world. I do believe some of what produced that was the conditions of manufactured by liberalism and, by extension, Marxism, communism, whatever, where people were like, we're losing our identity. We're being run by communists or by capitalists. We want to have Italy for the Italians or whatever, so on and so forth. And so I do think it was people seeking some type of coherent social order, a coherent social order that liberalism is inherently unable to give. And I would agree, the somewhat atheistic nature of fascism is definitely a weakness in the ideology. I think that there's no question about that. I've read the doctrine and doctrines of fascism, the two different. One was supposedly written by Mussolini, but apparently it wasn't really. And the other one was written by another Italian fascist philosopher. I don't necessarily get off to the idea that the state by itself is God, which is kind of how the fascists conceived of things. That's the first thing.
Well, the best essay that I have found on this question is Ivan Ilyan's essay on fascism. Have you by chance read that?
Which one? I'm sorry, Jay.
The Russian philosopher Ivan Ilyan. He has an essay called On Fascism.
I have not read it. No.
Yeah, it's pretty good. It's at Soul of the East. My buddy Mark translated it, and I think the essence of fascism is he talks about, number one, it tends to be, even though it can have an homage to religion, it tends to be absolutist in terms of the state. So the state takes on a sort of deified status, and so there's an irreligiousness about fascism, Ilian argues, where you eventually get a hostile attitude towards Christianity because of a lot of the tenets of Christianity, which want to limit the pride of man, limit the idea of an absolutist God emperor. That kind of stuff tends to run contrary to the pride of man. You get a sort of totalitarian state that does arise because it's supposed to be based on the ideals. So if you look at one of the key philosophers, you get like, Hegel's philosophy of the right, where he says the state is the march of God in history. So the state literally takes on the role of the church. It becomes what it's supposed to be. And the point of the Byzantine double-headed eagle is precisely balance. It's and that's not to say that the church is equal to the state, but that society is not wholly run by the state and it's not wholly run by the church. There's a balance between these two, and they have their respective spheres, but their respective spheres are also not absolutely independent. So, for example, the emperor can be excommunicated. Many of them have been, because they were heretics. And simultaneously, the church cannot always necessarily defend itself, because it's not, typically speaking, the role of ministers to take up the sword. Therefore, you have the Christian state to defend its people and to defend its church. That's the ideal. So not denying that there are ideals, or that people require ideals. They do. And there's never been some perfect Byzantine state or some perfect Christian imperium. There's always ideals that we try to strive for. And that's why the iconography of the history of the imperium is, again, embodied in the Byzantine double-headed eagle. And if you notice, they both wear a crown, and then there's a crown on their crowns. So what that signifies is that the harmony, the symphonia in the Greek, in society, is embodied in this very symbol. And anytime you chop off one of the heads, which is to make the state god, then you get essentially the one-headed eagle. You get, that's Rome, right? That's Rome is the eagle. If you chop off the other head, then you get, I don't know, the papacy, right? Where the church and state are basically combined into the papal states. So, the first 1,000 years of Christianity is embodied in its symbol. It's embodied in, on the one hand, on throne and altar, right? And it's no accident that, again, the revolutionary tradition, the Freemasons, sought to overthrow throne and altar. So another thing that happens in the tendency is you get a kind of one party monopoly in a party system. Usually fascism starts as a party, and then, because it's a party system in a state that allows political parties, when that party comes to dominate, it essentially tries to stamp out everything that disagrees with it. And this tends to demoralize people. I'm not saying, by the way, that you wouldn't necessarily have people stamping people out in a in a monarchy. That's happened for sure. But the problem is that fascist politics is also based on the idea inherited from the revolutionary tradition of the citizen, right? Like the citizen and the worker still are somehow given some sort of like deified status. They're treated like they're somehow special just because they're the engine of the society. And I'm not trying to down the middle class, but I'm just saying that there's a danger that you get in fascism that doesn't understand hierarchy and class systems. It tries to replace hierarchy with a new hierarchy that's almost kind of like Plato's Republic in a way. And Plato's Republic is very problematic because, number one, it's based on radical idealism. It's based on the idea of the philosopher king. That's essentially what the fascist party leader is a philosopher king. And it's just a bizarre mix is what I'm trying to say with fascism. You get these elements of populism, but also this weird sort of exaltation of the middle class and the working class, which I don't think is due. I mean, I'm not trying to be rude. I come from a middle class background, but I think that there's a reason why in the history of all societies, there's been a class structure. You can read, Proverbs. Solomon talks about nobles, and he talks about the working man. And everybody knew their place. And so even fascism, again, retains this revolutionary idea of the bizarre exaltation of the worker. There's what else? You get these social reforms within fascism, which is a form of socialism that takes the state into a very rigorous attempt to control the economy. So once again, that's where I would kind of side with monarchy in many ways, allowing for a little more freedom than fascism, because it's actually monarchy. People, they'll often talk about like the state licensure. Like if you have you could only sell this or that thing when the king gave you a license to do it. The reason for that was because it wasn't just because the king was trying to control it. It was because it was a protection against the sharks that would come in from foreign countries and try to outsell the people who were the natives. So the idea of tariffs and all that was to protect people. It wasn't just a scam. This is how the revolutionaries always portray it, because the revolutionaries were funded by middle and upper class merchants and bankers. So of course they want open borders. Of course, I'm not open borders. They want free trade, excuse me. Of course they want free trade. Well, those two kind of go together, by the way. They want free trade because if you're a merchant or a banker, free trade benefits you. If you're a king or a statesman and all your people are getting screwed over by the sharks that come in and undercut you with everyday low prices, like Walmart, your people get mad and they want to overthrow you. So that's why a king has tariffs. It's not because it's just scams. So this is a very annoying argument that I really get tired of from libertarians. But I think that ironically, you could argue that fascism can have some of those same problems, because it's not exactly clear in what sense, when we're erecting this imperium, because it's just the law of man, it's not exactly clear where we stop the borders of nations, where we stop trade, where we do any of this, because it falls back into like scientific regimentation. So fascism itself, I would argue, falls back into, or would collapse into, some form of transhumanism or technocracy. I think well, I won't say that because I don't want to go into the ifs, but and ultimately what happens is that it ends up in demagoguery and despotism, which is ironic because that's what's always leveled against monarchy. But I would argue that the historical trend of human societies at all times has always been monarchy, and that's not, there's a reason for that. Why is that?
Allow me to get a little Jordan here. Well, nature's hierarchical. There's hierarchy.
And I understand that in a way fascism could be construed as hierarchical. But anyway, that's some of the thoughts I have on fascism. A lot more could be said, but if you just want a basic essay of my critique of modern fascism, I would say read Ivan Ilyin on Fascism at Soul of the East.
I think I agree with you. I think that they are drawn to fascism, particularly as liberalism continues to fail in the 21st century, as the most recent system that seemed to provide some semblance of social order. I definitely see you as someone who wants to have social order, who wants to have hierarchies, but you, kind of like myself, and this is something I've kind of hearkened upon or you discovered through your work and a lot of your stuff, is you're weary of any system that makes man God, so to speak. And I could definitely see how that would be a valid criticism of fascism. The idea of creating the perfect man is definitely kind of inherently atheistic or transhumanistic, I think, without question.
Yes, absolutely.
And to kind of take a stark turn here, there was an interesting comment that I just saw in the chat that I want to hear your reaction to. Someone had said that you and I, Jay, we're very naive. The defeat of the Axis in World War II was the cornerstone for the destruction of the United States. After 1945, the liberals start to destroy the religion and culture of the West. Now, before you tee off on that, I would say I kind of take, and this is regretful, I'm not happy about this, but recently I've kind of started to take the Spenglerian approach to the destruction of the West, and that it was, to an extent, kind of baked into the cake a long time ago.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think we could just look at World War II as this is what caused the destruction of the USA because fascism.
Yeah, that's retarded. I did a whole nine lectures, eight lectures, like 16, 17 hours on Tragedy and Hope, which is a 1,300-page tome based on the Council on Foreign Relations archives that Dr. Quigley did. And so he's an establishment figure telling you what the CFR, which is the top of the power structure in the West, how they understood the 20th century and for what purpose the two world wars of the 20th century and the Cold War were served, basically. So first of all, the commenter's arrogance is disproven by the fact that the League of Nations preceded the United Nations and the attempt at the liberal world order prior to World War II. And it was the same bankers that organized World War II that organized World War I.
Yes.
Quigley talks about this at length. He also discusses it in his book, The Anglo-American Establishment. So no, actually, World War I and World War II, as even Friedman of Stratfor, the well-known pseudo-analysis CIA-connected geopolitical site, even Friedman of Stratfor, E. Michael Jones, independently of me, I'm not a big follower of E. Michael Jones, but the irony is that on some of these issues, we've come to the same conclusions independent of one another. He agrees. So the 20th century was essentially World War I and World War II were knocking out the Austro-Hungarian Empire and any idea or any position that would be based on authority by the Atlanticists. And the Cold War was essentially the wrecking of and the exhausting and dissipating of Russia, the other threat to the Atlanticist empire. So the two world wars and the Cold War had the effect of granting the Atlanticist powers the supremacy in the 20th century. So liberalism, by the way, had infected the Protestant churches in America and the Roman Catholic Church far prior to World War II. There were already problems and issues of modernism all the way back to the mid to late 1800s in Roman Catholicism. You can look at the papal encyclicals that deal with that. You can look at Pius X's encyclicals, Pacendi Dominici Gracious, which cover modernism and liberalism in the church in the 1800s, 1890s, I think, 1895, somewhere in there. Then you can look at the fact that the Rockefellers and other entities began to put very liberal persons in seminary positions by their power, by their funding prior to World War II. So there's already problems in Presbyterianism, mainline Lutherans. J. Garrison Machen wrote his book, I think, back in the 20s about the liberalism that was in the Presbyterian Church. So this person doesn't know what they're talking about. I've studied this shit for 20 years.
Well, there's also the component, which I was actually going to say this, but you knocked it out of the park, which is to remove World War II from World War I is, I mean, come on now. I mean, it's very difficult to overlook. Actually, I would say it's impossible, again, if you have an IQ in the triple digits, to overlook the goals of the bankers of the elite going into World War I. I mean, this is obvious. I would totally agree that if it wasn't the primary goal of World War I, and again, your Tragedy and Hope lectures certainly kind of weigh in on this. It certainly was a secondary goal to knock out traditionalism all over Europe. And even as a consequence of World War I know it goes back prior to the First World War, not by much, maybe 10 or 15 years, we saw, the transplanting of Lenin into Russia to overthrow the Russian Empire. Something that continues to this day to have, I would say, unbelievably negative ramifications for the entire world, overthrowing this relatively, or perhaps tremendously, depending on how you look at it, stable force in the East is going to have ramifications for a century, if not more so. And definitely
the Royal Society, the Cliveden set, they specifically decided that Chamberlain would do the dual policy. So for many years prior to World War II, they would build up and aid Hitler. And even as World War II began, France and the UK were still aiding Hitler. They were still giving him armaments, food, money. This is all documented in Tragedy and Hope. Why is that? Well, because they wanted him to do this. They wanted him to be the monster that he became because it knocked out their enemies. It's British intelligence that flew Mussolini out of Italy. It was MI6 that did that, by the way. That's also covered in the chapter on Italy. And what you start to notice is that the Royal Society was correct. They realized that these wars had the tremendous impact of not just knocking out their enemies, but also putting them under generations of debt slavery with what they owed after the war. And they're still paying on that. And that was absolutely designed by the makers. They literally at the conferences after the wars, they would have bankers there setting up the payments and the payment systems and what you owed. The bankers drew up the post-World War world. Yeah.
You touched on the dual policy of the UK. I was on my honeymoon like 5 months ago now. I was reading actually Pat Buchanan's book. It's like Hitler, Churchill, and the Unnecessary War. And even Pat Buchanan, who is relatively more mainstream, but he will wander off the beaten path every now and again in a way that I think makes me think he knows more than he's willing to let on.
Sure.
Even he brings up the concept of the British policy of making sure that Europe itself did not ever become united, and how the British would always side with the weaker alliance half of Europe to make sure Europe didn't become united, because it would threaten the hegemonic control of the British Empire. And
absolutely,
for sure, we could trace the rise of fascism and even the rise of communism to the meddling of the Anglo-American powers. I think that there is no question about that, and it would be, I think, foolish to assume otherwise. And so when we look at people,
in fact, there's even a guy who argues Hitler was a British agent, and I don't even put that out of the realm of possibility, because
I read that book, by the way. It's crazy.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, if you recall, Quigley talks about how Ribbentrop was a regular attendee at the Astor estate, which is the Cliveden. Cliveden is essentially the Astors, the Royal Society, and the Rothschilds. That's what that is. That's who ran the show. And when you view it from that perspective, again, the 20th century makes sense. And the 20th century knocked out two main rivals to the Atlanticist power block, and now they're on top. And what's left? Well, mopping up operations in so-called rogue nations.
I agree. Hitler was a British agent. I don't necessarily agree with the assertion that he was a British agent, but what the author does get at in the book is not so much that like Hitler was necessarily working for MI5 or MI6, as much as the man himself was taking funding from whoever would give it to him, and it was the Anglo-American establishment. That's right. That much is obvious.
But you're aware, though, of the many British nobles and royals that were very pro-Hitler, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, even so much so, an interesting point about that a lot of people don't like to talk about is how during the height of World War II, Rudolf Hess jumped in an airplane and flew across the channel in an attempt to deliver a peace treaty to the British royalty, who were pro-Hitler, while Churchill himself was anti-Hitler. So there's a lot of, and it was really
Ian Fleming who was involved in that, and his brother wrote about it a year before it happened.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Peter Fleming has a story where a high-ranking Nazi leader, I think he makes it Hitler, flies to Scotland in a secret meeting a year before it happened.
Again, it doesn't surprise me based on what I've read. It's obviously so much of what we learn about in history is just the whitewashed, ridiculous version that of course is almost always being told by the victors, right? That's just.
I think I put that in my book. Let me make sure. Let me see what the name of the Peter Fleming novel is. Let's see. Midnight Flight or something like that. Peter Fleming, Nazi flight novel. An unintended visit, The Flying Visit in 1940. Peter Fleming wrote The Flying Visit in 1940. By the way, H.G. Wells predicted World War II some years before it happened as well. I wonder how he did that.
Didn't Spengler have some pretty creepy predictions about the decline of the West, to the point of like the dates almost being correct, even though I think he wrote Death of the West during World War I, if I'm not mistaken?
I think that sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah. But I would agree. Again, I do look at World War I and World War II as, I mean, without question, extremely regrettable scenarios that never should have happened. I mean, it's awful. It's a disaster, and it was done to further the power of the power elite, so to speak. But I think it's we can't just look at this and say this is what caused the decline. The problem with a coherent philosophy in the West dates back to much further than obviously World War I or World War II, which is you and I have been saying the entire time.
No, right. Well, I do systems analysis, so I know how worldviews work, and what I study is how they cohere and how they break down. So that's actually the area I would say I'm an expert in, is in how worldviews function. So we were talking earlier about transcendental argument for God and using that kind of apologetic. That's because that's a paradigm level, worldview level argument, and it's much more powerful and useful and consistent and coherent than the typical kind of lame so-called classical apologetic arguments where people say, look at the earthworm, see how it's designed, don't you think there's a designer maybe? That's a very, very weak argument. It's deconstructed in the Enlightenment, ironically. And the funny thing is that when you listen to, like you talk about with Dawkins and these kind of characters debating the evangelicals, the irony is that if you've read a lot of the debates with the atheists of the Enlightenment period, they're both rehashing the same stuff. Like Bishop Usher is making the exact same arguments, hundreds of years ago that David Hume was making hundreds of years ago, right? To an atheist and the so-called Christian, and you're seeing it reflected nowadays. They're an echo chamber rehashing and repeating the same stupid arguments for the last 300 or 400 years. So the advantage of a transcendental argument is it's much more powerful, much more fundamental, and it challenges paradigms. And that's where people argue from, is from their presuppositions and their paradigms. So what it is a kind of comparing systems to see which belief system is more coherent, which one holds up, which one offers the possibility of justifying claims, ethical claims, metaphysics, how we know things, et cetera, as opposed to a different system, which really can't justify that thing. So you mentioned earlier, I'm going to bring this up to why this is relevant here in a second, but you mentioned JF. Well, my point when I debated JF was that the materialist, nihilist worldview cannot account for ethics, cannot account for knowledge or epistemology, which is how we know things. And it can't account for metaphysics, how we know there's an external world, what's real, what's not real, et cetera. So all the things that he thinks underlie his naive scientism, actually he can't give any account for, and they don't make any sense given his worldview presuppositions. So that's the kind of argument that I think is much, much stronger. But it's not just some kind of hat trick, parlor trick word game that you do, against some arrogant atheist. It's actually something that you do when you look at ideologies or systems over time. So you can look at periods in history, you can look at civilizations like Spengler does when he talks about them having a spirit, talks about them having a birth, a life, and a death, Genesis period to death period. He's doing systems analysis with civilizations. I believe you can do that. Now, a lot of modern thinkers don't. They think this is all taboo and a relic of the ancient world. I don't. I believe that it's fundamental and that you can do it because it shows itself all the time. Because when you notice how systems work, you can see how they break down. We see it in computers, right? Computers get viruses, they break down. Well, guess what? Societies do the same thing.
Yeah.
If they get viruses, they break down. And again, we all know there's no perfect society. This is not some autistic thing where it's like, I'm going to erect the perfect technocratic libertarian society. We'll all link into the computers and we'll all exchange our bitcoins via our thoughts. No, it's not like that. It's looking at how if the Roman Catholic system of the Middle Ages adopts belief XYZ about the papacy or about society or about whatever, it's going to lead to XYZ down the road. And you can, trace this through to the, say, nominalists of the Middle Ages and Occam and Bile and these kind of characters. And you can see how that leads to Luther saying that I'm in the nominalist tradition and I reject, these papal doctrines. So you can see the influence of ideologies over time and how they play out and how they go into forming a character like Luther, right? I'm not touting Luther as a good guy. I think Luther was a lunatic, but I can see the things that went into making Luther. Not perfectly, but I can see it generally from the ideological track. And so I can do the same thing when I look at America, no different than what Spengler does or anybody else does when they look at societies, histories, cultures, traditions, nations, civilizations, empires, is that they try to form these kind of overall analyses by considering the ethos, the paradigm, the belief, the practice, the art, all of it, right? This is why Roman Catholicism produces a different society, a different art than Orthodoxy does. There's a different statecraft. There's a different, all kinds of different stuff because it's two different systems. So I know I'm rambling. I sound a little autistic here, but the point is just that the same thing can be done when we look at America, when we look at the revolutionary tradition. Anybody who doesn't think America, comes out of the revolutionary tradition and that its system isn't affected by, 1700s Freemasonry is an idiot. I mean, that's an obvious thing. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, I studied this on a grad level. I'm not bullshitting. I know what I'm talking about.
Well, I think it's also, ironically, what you're saying, you studied on a graduate level is also common sense to anyone who removes themselves from just propaganda, right? I mean, this is not terribly hard to figure out. Like, I mean, maybe it is. Maybe most people just aren't on that level. They're not thinking outside the box. But what I mean is, you touched on something great, which was the how a virus affects a society and how viruses get injected into a computer, so to speak, or to a human or to civilization as a whole, and how they will run themselves out, I think, in many respects, unfortunately, to its logical conclusion. And I get into a lot of debates with friends of mine who think I'm totally insane for saying the stuff that I'm saying, because I am daring to venture off of the very small island of liberalism that's allowed to be discussed. And so these are people who sense that things are wrong, but their answer is to listen to Dave Rubin, right? Mm-hmm. Or to Sam Harris or to Jordan Peterson, without understanding that almost all political discourse and debate in the West, be it on MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, or even what I would call the first layer of alternative media, which might be your Alex Joneses, your Stefan Molly News, they're still all arguing for liberalism. They're just basically saying, well, we got to get back to the Constitution, right? Like that's really where we screwed up. Like we got off track when we got away from real liberalism. So now these people aren't really liberals. Keep going.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, so I think that the first thing we have to do, and I get asked a lot about solutions, people are saying, well, hey, Jefferson, you're really good at talking about problems. Well, what's the solution? Well, I mean, there could be many possible solutions, but I think the first thing we have to do is get rid of the liberal filter in our brains and start to view things in a different light. Because every debate you see, would be it Ben Shapiro versus Cenk Uygur or whatever, you look at this debate and you think to yourself, oh, wow, these guys are so different. But they're actually not. They're literally debating with each other over who is more liberal than the other.
It's always that, yeah, and no person is allowed into the mainstream discourse who doesn't have the presuppositions of classical liberalism. That's all that's allowed. You're not even allowed in, and that alone should tell you something that even your alternative discourse is controlled. You can't have any alternative discourse outside of modern liberalism. I think everybody kind of recognizes this now. I mean, who's not an idiot who thinks that Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro are like revolutionary thinkers or something? Actually, they are revolutionary thinkers because they're just copycats of the idiot revolutionaries of 300 or 400 years ago. So in that regard, they are, quote, revolutionary thinkers. But yeah, I mean, but personally, my trek into this, it wasn't a situation where, I was just trying to be eccentric or weird or just take some counter revolutionary position for the heck of it. It was because I got really into church history. I looked at the history of the church. I got into biblical theology, biblical law, studying how the law came to be, how that diverged off into different things like the Talmud, the tradition of Christian law in the West and in the East, in Byzantium and then in the Latin West. So yeah, I got really, really deep into that for most of my 20s. And it just became evident to me that when I started reading about the history of monarchy, when I started reading about why Christianity for so many centuries, for 2 millennia, consistently had monarchs and they consistently had coronation ceremonies where they anointed monarchs. The church does this, right? It just became obvious to me, like, well, why? I've grown up in America. I've grown up in this kind of Baptist, libertarian small government ethos. How do we have this view in America so divergent from everything that I read about in the history of Christianity, in the history of the West, right? I mean, the history of the West is not this Faustian bargain. I mean, you could argue that Spangler's kind of right that Western man has this temptation or this impulse to be Faustian. That's true, but I don't think that necessarily means that characterizes the man of the West. I don't think we would say that, you know, all of the, I wouldn't characterize Byzantium, which you could argue is a European civilization. I wouldn't say it's Faustian. That doesn't make any sense. But, you know, he's speaking of Western man, Western European man. Yeah, there's that temptation to Faustianism, but I'm not so sure that that's like bound up with his very being, because this is all turned into, you know, a Nietzschean apologetic by some people. And I don't think that Western man's Faustian impetus is going to end well. I think we're seeing the fruits of it now. And how do I say that? Well, because the Faustian impetus leads to the revolutionary tradition, and it leads to the idea of the atomization of society. You mentioned earlier libertarian economic theory. Well, you can't divorce this from what E. Michael Jones talked about with Whig economics and British economic theory and Newtonianism. I made that critique. And I'm not saying E. Michael Jones ripped me off. I'm not saying that at all, but I didn't read his book. And I wrote that article about Newtonian economics and libertarianism 3 or 4 years ago. And again, independently of E. Michael Jones, we came to the same conclusion that what he calls Whig economics, British Anglo empiricist economic theory, utilitarianism, moral calculus bullshit, this kind of Bentham stuff, it's just a logical outworking of the metaphysics and the philosophical assumptions of Newtonianism, right? And it's no wonder that atomistic philosophy and physics leads to atomized individuals in society. And Dugin's right to say that atomized individuals leads to splitting up the individuals, because they start getting biometrical shit put on their body. They get their arms cut off and they put on a robot arm. I'm not saying prosthetics are bad, but I'm saying that he's making the point that I can exchange my penis for a vagina. I can exchange my man boobs for girl tits, or I guess you'd turn the man boobs into girl tits. I don't know, bitch tits, right? From Fight Club or something. But I mean, in other words, it's a logical conclusion that if everything is just kind of interchangeable economic units, then it logically leads to the conclusion that so is your gender. Your gender is just an economically exchangeable, interchangeable series of units. And you could be like Mr. Potato Head, like you could put your little fake pee-pee on one day, and then you could put your little fake vajayjay on another day. You could be like Mr. because that's the ultimate consumer society individual, isn't it? Right. And that's the apex of what it is to be apparently American. Sorry, I went on a weird rant there, but
no, I'm following you, because again, when you start to look at the idea of what radical individualism eventually will lead to, it's not that hard to understand that we are where we are at for a reason, right? This didn't just happen overnight. Okay, the removal of the individual from society, the idea that you are your own person, your own species or kin or whatever, has over time dragged us into something that's completely absurd, and we see, playing out every single day. I mean, and it's, by the way, it's obviously accelerating. I mean, I'm
you can look at if you doubt that this was an longer plan, look at New Atlantis. Look at Bacon's New Atlantis. I mean, Bacon's coming out of this weird mix of empiricism and Rosicrucianism, this weird conglomeration of Enlightenment philosophy and so-called scientism that somehow mixes with like Hermeticism and Rosicrucianism. It's very bizarre, but that's what Bacon's philosophy, that's what New Atlantis is. So, that's proof right there that the idea of America has always been to be some sort of experiment, some sort of New Atlantis. How cognizant everybody was 300-400 years ago, I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to pretend to, but I mean, I think that suggests to some degree it was, and other writings suggest this as well in the history of Masonry. So again, I mean, if you're familiar with the basics of Freemasonry, Albert Pike and all that, and again, if anybody who doubts me on that should recognize that even the fascists persecuted the Masons. I mean, the fascists recognized that the Masons had this ultimately sort of atheistic, degenerate philosophy about them, and that they were a revolutionary force within society, and that the lodges formed basically intelligence networks for rival powers, most likely Britain, since the lodge of the biggest lodge in the world is London.
I totally agree, and it is pretty funny. I actually remember reading about that relatively recently and being quite fascinated how so many of the fascists were like, we got to get these guys the hell out of our country or jail them or whatever, whereas they founded our country. So it is quite interesting because, again, you'll see people within the alt-right that will at the same time advocate for the liberal tradition, which, as you said before, obviously correctly, is rooted in Masonry, but then at the same time will idolize fascist dictators for their displays of strength and or nationalism. And this is simply, I think, not a coherent worldview. I think we have to understand these things don't work together. They don't work together.
It's important to keep in mind that nationalism, a lot of people don't know this, but nationalism is also part of the revolutionary tradition. So now I'm not saying that I'm not a nationalist. It depends on what you mean, but I'm not a civic nationalist. I'm also not a pure racial determinist, but the actual history of nationalism is as a revolutionary movement. And so sometimes the left will criticize the right about this, and they're correct. They're actually right when they talk about the fact that it's out of the French Revolution that you get revolutionary nationalism. And most modern states who claim to be nation states adopted that model precisely because they invited the lodge into all of their countries. And guess what? Magically, the secret society that has the oath to overthrow throne and altar magically overthrew all the thrones and altars throughout the world and set up democratic republics. I wonder why that is. I wonder can I put this puzzle piece together? I've got like the giant diagram on the wall, and I've got the strings going from one pin to another, like a crazy conspiracy theorist. So is it really that hard to figure out that a revolutionary society that has an oath to overthrow throne and altar that went into every country overthrew all the thrones and altars? Is that difficult? Can anybody figure that out?
Of course not. And touching on our topic before about liberalism being the mode of thought that's the only mode of thought that is allowed in any political discourse. I mean, what is one of the few things that you'll see constantly being genuflected towards both on Fox News and MSNBC? Democracy, right? Someone is threatening our democracy. Trump is a threat to our democracy. Trump is upholding our democracy. They're never going to let you think that there are alternative traditions and ideas that perhaps might provide a more stable and more coherent version of the nation state. That's
and every time that comes up with any so-called intellectual, you will hear them argue that that's what the 20th century was about, was overthrowing the relics of the past, namely authoritarian regimes. That is, regimes, systems that relied on authority. Well, that's how the traditional and medieval world viewed things. It's based on authority. If the church is based on authority and you have a hierarchy in the church, then doesn't it stand to reason that society is hierarchical? Doesn't it stand to reason that if the family is hierarchical, so is society? Well, of course it does. But they want to pretend that you can have your private church life divorced from the social arena. You can have a democratic social society where everyone's somehow equal, but then in your private life you can have this esoteric hierarchy. So that the whole mode of democratic republics itself is already kind of presupposing and lends itself to secret societies and shadow government.
Your talk about hierarchy is actually hierarchy in and of itself. Was the concept of it is one of the biggest red pills, believe it or not, that I've actually ever had in my life. And the way that I discovered hierarchy as being something natural, I'm from New York. It's not a terribly religious tradition in this area. A lot of this is terribly left-leaning. But I got into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu back when I was 19. So that's like around 2005.
Yeah, right.
and you arrive on your first day, you put on your gi and your white belt. And, before every class, you line up, you bow to the instructor, and you do your warm up. And when you first start, you are at the very end of that line, and you deserve it because you get this shit kicked out of you every single day for a really, really long time until you're able to actually have the willpower and you acquire the skill and you kind of move up that hierarchy. But what's really cool about martial arts and about the way it supports some type of hierarchical system is that you're well aware when you're at the end of that line that you don't belong at the beginning of that line because you're not good enough. Someone knows more than you, and you work your way up that system, and it makes sense. And when you've spent years training like I have, and you're now working towards the front of that line that you bow in on every class, you realize, hey, I earned this. There is a skill set, behind this. There is
Sure.
knowledge. There's things that I've worked for many, many years through blood, sweat, and tears to obtain. And when you take that concept of a system and you take it out of just your jiu-jitsu classroom and you apply it to a social order or to a church or to a family, these things make sense inherently. I often say to people
everybody
that
knows it too.
Yeah,
everybody knows
it's just heavy propaganda that makes us avoid hierarchy, right?
Right, because leftism is fundamentally at its root a war on reality. And in fact, I did a talk on Umberto Eco, the famous semiotician, a couple years ago, because Eco is known for his novels like The Name of the Rose, which is a pretty good book, and Foucault's Pendulum and stuff like that. But he's also he's probably the foremost semiotician. And he wrote an essay, though, I think in the 90s or early 2000s, about he sees himself obviously as a liberal, a deconstructionist, a postmodernist. And he boils it down very well because he says that the liberal war is not against a political system. It's not against a religious system. He says the real battle of all liberalism at all times, in all places, and forever is the battle against eternal fascism, which he says is the idea that there's such a thing as truth. so that I've always thought that's the absolute best explanation for how to encapsulate all liberalism, is one of its great champions essentially saying that it's an eternal battle against truth, against Jesus, against logos, against truth.
And that probably is, and it's funny, sometimes you have to look to your enemy, so to speak, for some type of definition for what you believe in or what you have to rally around. And for a liberal philosopher, so to speak, to come out and say, yeah, we are in eternal war against truth, it goes to show you that in order for us to resist liberalism, we should not embrace Americanism or constitutionalism or whatever, but we should embrace a shared truth that I think does come from a religious source.
I think that's the only way to justify truth, because truth is itself a metaphysical notion. It's an epistemological notion. It's something that is that transcends any single individual in terms of human finitude. By its very definition, truth suggests eternality. It suggests that it's not subject to flux, that it's not going to change into its opposite tomorrow, right? So 2 + 2 will always be 4. It's not going to become 4,000 tomorrow. It wasn't 4,000 yesterday or 10 years ago. It will always be 4. And that proves very simply that truth is eternal. Truth doesn't change. Everyone knows this. And this is why, again, I think the Christian metaphysic, the Christian anthropology actually explains man. It explains why man hates the truth, why man is born, in a sense, illiberal, in rebellion because of the fall. Yes, absolutely. And that's why you have to reorient your mind, change your mind, and turn towards truth. If you don't, you're essentially causing a dissociation within yourself. And again, Orwell perfectly characterized that as doublethink. Double mind and doublethink aren't just propaganda. They're actually states of being in the leftist himself.
That's a great point. And I want to ask Jay, because again, like I said before, a lot of people are asking, oh, what about solutions? Where do we go from here? Yes, you guys, you're diagnosing the problems, right? You know what's going on. We agree with you, you've helped us discover what the problem is. Where do you see the present day liberal globalist order going? How does it play out? Will there be a successful pushback against this, or does society kind of need to crash in a sense, and we have to have something kind of rise up out of the ashes of this? What is what do we have to think about going forward?
Well,
in
if
terms of
liberalism
solving
and
the problem?
degeneracy went out, you're going to have collapse because those systems always collapse. Plato saw this a long time ago. He knew that democracy is so stupid and so absurd because it's really mobocracy controlled by shadow oligarchy. So even Plato knew that. Even Plato knew that it was moneyed oligarchs that run democracy, and that they basically just play the masses and their passions like an instrument, like a tool. So those kinds of things collapse very quickly, I think.
And I just want to interject real quick. Is there a greater example of that than the political debates occurring in America right now?
Sure. I mean,
right, come on.
Mob Antifa, mobocracy is where it leads. And I think it's Socrates that said that. He says essentially that democracy leads to anarchy and tyranny. So if the left wins, then that's where we'll go. If the so-called right is going to have any power or function, it has to realize that it needs to step outside. I would say it needs to step outside of the of liberalism. The right is a captive of liberalism, and it doesn't even know it. Now, I'm not the only person who said this. There have been plenty of people on the right, going back to the paleocons, who started noticing that this was happening. They noticed that this is what William F. Buckley was doing in intentionally sabotaging the right by taking it into libertarianism, which is what he did, and he did it on purpose. So the right was co-opted for over many decades into being a bullshit version of liberalism. And they all went along with it because they had no ideological, philosophical paradigm foundations to guard against it. Why would they? They're all going to the same liberal brainwashing institutions as everybody else. So I don't see much hope for any of these existing, idiot paradigms of like democracy and voting and all this bullshit. I mean, Quigley said voting has been a scam for 100 years, and he wrote that in the 60s. So from the 1860s to the 1960s, according to Quigley, voting has been a scam. I mean, aside from voting at your local stuff, he's talking about like big elections are a scam. I mean, and the whole idea of like putting in some new crook after every 4 years, that's so retarded if you stop and think about it. Which, by the way, is an interesting point about monarchy, side note, because a monarch is accountable for his whole life, and he's accountable to the people. And many monarchs lost their head when they didn't fulfill their duties to the people, because the guy who's trying to win your vote, all he cares about is the vote. He's not accountable to the people because he's out of there in 2 years, 4 years after he's scammed his, got all his lobbying money or whatever scam he's running. So the motivations are completely different.
That's a great point you made about voting. Two things that I want to say, and I want to hear your points on it. There's a YouTuber that my friend Josh just told me to start following. His name is Apollonian Germ or something like that. He's like more of a pagan or whatever, but he had a great video on democracy, which was the idea that everybody participates in the government, which again, I think on a local level is okay. But like you said, on a national level within an imperium, it's totally retarded. It has the side effect of alienating people who are on the losing side, because democracy makes you think, okay, well, the ruling class is popular, or these ideas are popular because the people are voting for it. Even if it's only 51/49, democracy has an astonishing ability to alienate people who want to put forward effective or fundamental or foundational criticisms of the current order, because it's all based on, quote unquote, popularity. That for sure is a major.
No, there's 100 different ways to cut. I mean, I totally agree. I'm not disagreeing. There's so many ways to critique the stupidity of like a duopoly and split the population down the middle of the left and the right. I mean, it's an obvious mechanism for control, and it's really stupid because the whole system itself is based on relativism. Democracy is a relativistic system. It's a system where there's not actually truth and falsehood. There's power and checks on power. That's the opposite of a system based around truth and falsehood. Well, there is truth and falsehood, right? I mean, 2 + 2 is not 5. So there is truth and falsehood. And if there's such a thing as truth and falsehood, and if 2 + 2 does not equal 5, then you can't structure society around relativism, which democracy is, and expect it to work. So it already is a virus, and it implodes. It collapses. And Plato knew it 2,000, 3,000 years ago. Why can't anybody else figure that out? Well, because of, as you said, propaganda, and because of wanting to be in the discourse, and you don't make your mammon if you don't go along with the acceptable political discourse. Well, the acceptable political discourse is for a bunch of 6th graders and is literally retard level. I mean, just think about how stupid it is that you're supposed to vote for some guy in Washington every 4 years whom you've never met, you have no contact with, you don't know anything about his past or his history. You just get to see funny ads on TV and a million signs everywhere. That's how retarded this is. What in the world? Who in the world would come up with something so retarded? Well, capitalistic con men would come up with that. Of course they would. They're selling you a product, and you think you're participating in it. You don't have any participation at all. Your vote means absolutely nothing.
Well, yeah, that's a fantastic point. I was a friend of mine who was a little bit more alt-right, but he has a lot of great critiques of the support of Trump, the kind of mindless support of Trump you see from a lot of American nationalists, whatever that term even really means. Mm-hmm. And you raise a great point, which is you see a lot of these people, these Trump supporters out there, and I supported Trump because I thought that as like a logo, in a sense, he was kind of an important pushback against globalism. There was a populistic component to Trump that I liked, but I don't want to sit back and say that I knew that he would cure all of our ails. I'm not in the QAnon camp, which is probably the most retarded camp you could be in. I certainly wouldn't say that, but there's this idea that if you just vote for this guy, that everything will turn out just fine. Well, if he knows he has your blanket support no matter what, then nothing will actually change. And so you look at, and this was something that really fascinated me about various voices within the alt-right, which was Trump got into power and they kind of bought this line that Trump's not getting anything done on immigration or whatever, as if these things would actually change the course of America, which I don't even know if they really would at this point. But he's not getting anything done because we haven't voted hard enough for the Republican Party. So just, I don't care what you got to do. Show up and hold your nose and vote for the GOP. It's such a ridiculous concept when you think, why not engage in some type of if you are going to engage in democracy, why not engage in a dissident minority strategy where you literally say, hey, if I'm a leader of the alt-right, I can guarantee you X amount of votes, which by the way is what the Jewish community does, particularly in New York, or the Muslim community does in Minnesota. I will not deliver the votes of my community if you don't address our needs. This idea that we just mindlessly vote for someone no matter what, and we just got to keep doubling and tripling and quadrupling down on support because he needs our support. It's not how you get anything done regardless. And the system is still ridiculous. Don't get me wrong, but it shows we don't even know how to manipulate the system for our own good.
Mm-hmm. No, those are great points. I mean, yeah, there's countless different ways you could cut this to show, the absurdity of voting in democracy. So I don't really hold out a lot of hope for anything in this existing system changing. Yeah. I tend to promote ideas that I think are perennial. Monarchy is something that's always been around. These experiments with democracy and republicanism, this is all new. So people can act like, oh, well, you don't really have a table at the discourse. That's fine. I don't really want a table at a discourse with a bunch of idiots, because I mean, what I'm talking about is proven. It's stood the test of time. All societies operated this way historically. So we're in the bizarro experiment land, and just look out at what was produced. It's purple-haired tranny freaks. So if that's what I'm being excluded from, count me out, bro. Yeah. Don't have me at the table. I don't want to eat your soybean meal at the trans table. That's fine. You can count me out. So yeah, I mean, that's where it's all going. And then, obviously from here, we're going to go into, they're going to try to bring in the technocracy. So, even a lot of this political nonsense is really kind of a drop in the bucket. I mean, I know it matters in the sense of the demographics and all that. I understand all that, but I'm saying that down the road, if the left has its way, the liberal imperium and so forth, and they put into place the technocracy that they intend to, all this stuff's not even going to matter anyway, because it's going to be such a tyranny that it could even be apocalyptic in scope.
That's a daunting way to look at it, but I'd have a hard time disagreeing with you.
Well, they all say that in their books. I mean, they all write books saying that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. It's unfortunate. You don't want to. It's not something you want to focus on, but you have to be well aware of what your enemy is thinking, what they want to do with you, and how absolute the game certainly is. But I definitely agree with you. The day-to-day political discourse, which ironically I started this channel focusing on that in kind of a Styx Hexenhammer type way. And then the more I read, the more I moved away from it. Like what the fuck do I care about what someone said about someone in the media today? It becomes ridiculous.
This is another element of the stupidity of the system, which again falls back on this Enlightenment notion of the informed citizen, right? This is the idea that when everybody is educated in society, because that's the goal, is that everybody receives public education and they're socialized, and then they're educated, and they're all little Thomas Jeffersons who run around and they read all the different quarterlies, and they read their academic journals, and they're able to head back to the farm after a day at the salon discussing the political theories of Montesquieu with Franklin over a cup of coffee and a blah blah. No, that's not how humans act. And yes, that might be true for certain white people, but generally speaking, that's not how people act. That's not how society acts. And I don't even think that that's really true of white people either. I don't think that all these farmers in the Revolutionary War, who, yes, I understand, I've seen the old education manuals, they were educated and all this, but I mean, even that, it's still absurd to expect the farmer to understand geopolitics and foreign policy. It's stupid. Why would you expect that? Why would you expect a social order to cohere around this idea of the educated, informed citizen? This is an old progressive idea out of the Enlightenment that is just obviously not true. Now, I'm not saying we ought to, the dark side of this is, so let's just keep everybody dumb and, take this sort of dark globalist view or Nietzschean view. I don't believe that. I don't think that that's been the goal of Christianity. Again, it is true that the Enlightenment, all this stuff, progressivism is a bastardization of Christianity. It's a removal of the supernatural elements of Christianity and making it into a sort of social utopian type situation, which is the revolutionary faith. Let's purge Christianity of its supernatural elements, and let's turn it into some sort of social program, like a giant nationwide global social program.
Isn't that what Thomas Jefferson tried to do? Didn't Thomas Jefferson have like a mock New Testament where he removed the divine elements of Jesus Christ and just kept
in all miracles because he's the father of Unitarian Universalism? Yes.
Yeah, that's again that now puts Thomas Jefferson to me in quite a different light. Again, we spoke about this in the first time we ever spoke, which was there is this deification of the founding fathers that is considered acceptable within the United States. Like if you doubt what this guy said, particularly if you're a conservative.
Well, dude, the informed citizen nonsense has led to the idea of all these women journalists with blue check marks who don't know anything about anything, but they have all this power in society.
Yeah.
That's the end result of the idiocy of the so-called informed citizen. Now, that may not have been what the founding fathers meant, but so what? That's where it led to. I don't care what they intended it to be. You can debate that all day. This is where we are now.
Well, there's a great point about what the founding fathers intended. You could even argue what they intended versus what they actually did, or of course, two totally different things. It shows you how incoherent Americanism or liberalism really is.
Yes.
When you look at, okay, you fight this revolutionary war, supposedly. And of course, we all know it was fundamentally about power to an extent. The elites in the colonies didn't want to pay taxes back to the elites in Britain. And that was a large part what the war was fought over. But you have the Constitution written 1787, 1788. George Washington becomes the first president. And well, what happens? Almost immediately, he unconstitutionally crushes the Whiskey Rebellion, right? Acting almost like an authoritarian monarch to prove the legitimacy of his regime. And you could say, okay, well, maybe it ends there. Well, then we could go to John Adams. We could say John Adams jailed journalists under the Alien and Sedition Act, right? So they didn't even really, even if they wrote this pen to paper. These are the guys that wrote the Constitution. They fought this war. They supposedly fought for these Enlightenment principles. But then when they got into power, acted illiberally.
Mm-hmm.
It shows you what a farce this concept is in many respects.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And, people will make very similar parallels to the Roman Empire and Rome going from the Republic to the Empire and crossing the Rubicon, and America crossed the Rubicon when it had Marbury versus Madison. That's what allowed the Supreme Court to have the final say-so on the Constitution. And before that, every man had the right to. This is all just nonsense. It's all retarded. I mean, I spent years in the paleo-con libertarian circles and Calvinist circles, and I get really deep into America and Americanism at one point. But it was like 21, 2, 3, 4 in that period, and then I started reading. I noticed that a lot of these Calvinists and Americanists were big fans of Augustine, so I started reading St. Augustine. And now wait a minute, he's not a Calvinist. He's not. He doesn't believe in Americanism, certainly. So you get into his political theory, and it's very different, and that opens up avenues. You start to realize that maybe the answers to everything weren't from the year 1600 on. Maybe there's other insights. Maybe the ancients had wisdom that is perennial and still abides. And obviously Solomon seemed to think that. He wrote Proverbs. He talks about kings a lot in there. Maybe Solomon knows what he's talking about. Then you realize, oh, wait a minute, the church in history has always had monarchs. Well, maybe there's something to that. Maybe there's something fundamental to maintaining a society when you have a hopefully male monarch, a patriarchy, and his family. Well, that seems to suggest, an icon of the family. That seems to promote family. Even when those situations are corrupted, even when you have a bad monarch, you still have the image of, it still retains the image of how it should be. And the irony is that any time, a Republican or a Democrat or a fascist or any of the people that make the criticisms of monarchy, it just, to me, it all rings hollow, because so many of those criticisms seem to be more true when we read about the liberal governments, when we read about democracies, when we read about republics. We seem to see, in my view, a lot more corruption, a lot more reason for corruption than what we would see just considering the systems ideally, right? So I'm not saying that there ever been perfect monarchs or anything like that. I mean, we're not naive here. We're not stupid. I'm talking about, just comparing systems, right? So just in theory, and even ancient philosophers have noticed this. They've talked about the superiority of a republic over a democracy. Well, I would agree with that. But does that mean republicanism is the best form of government? I don't think so. I think that you can make a very strong argument that monarchy is superior. And again, has nothing to do with whether there won't be corrupt monarchs.
You're right. And guys, I want to say real quick, Jay, how you doing on energy, by the way?
I'm great.
Good. So
you want to close down? I'm good.
No, I got some more time. I want to say, guys, eventually before we get out of here, I want Jay to answer some of your questions. So if you have questions, start dumping them in the chat, and we'll get to the best ones in a sec. But I do want to say, in regards to the concept of monarchism versus democracy, one of the things that I often find so frustrating about the present day system is the inability of the democratic republic or democracy, whatever the hell we're calling ourselves nowadays, to make effective laws for its people, because these laws are not constitutional, right? And so we have this weird tendency in American society to autistically debate what the founders intended versus what society actually needs nowadays. This drives me crazy, which is we can't even pass effective immigration laws because we have to somehow have these people. This is not a popular thing to say, but I'm just kind of out and fucking say it. I don't care. We have a Supreme Court who are like these deities who are designed to somehow magically interpret what men said hundreds of years ago, as if that matters to what the American people need today. And so,
isn't that interesting? Because that's the exact same way that the Protestants view the scriptures. And isn't it interesting that the entire ethos of early Americanism is Protestantism, except for the carols, like the token Catholics there. The whole spirit of it is Protestant. The Enlightenment comes out of the Protestant Reformation eventually. Those systems are are inexplicably intertwined, and they always will be. And so the idea that every man can just go read his pocket constitution, well, that sounds like sola scriptura, doesn't it? That sounds like an evangelical Protestant view of the Bible. Well, of course it does, because they're intimately bound up together. And then what happens in practice? Oh, we need this magisterial body, the Supreme Court, Marbury versus Madison, right? We get a magisterium to now interpret the Constitution for us. So in praxis, the stupidity of these positions is shown. They don't work.
Yeah, and it shows that you could make an argument, and I think this would be the correct argument, that a government's foremost responsibility is to protect the interest of its people, secure the border, like very basic things that we are unable to do because even the Republican Party, the conservatives, the right wing, the people who supposedly care about these things are ironically unwilling to do so if the Supreme Court says you can't do it because the Constitution said so. It's totally retarded. And yeah. I understand there could be people who are interested in the type of man that Thomas Jefferson was, or John Adams, or George Washington. I could go on. I get it. But that's history. History is not the same thing as us making decisions about what needs to be done today. And it's so retarded that we're like, oh, well, we're going to let our country get destroyed because we don't think that Thomas Jefferson would have approved of bringing troops to the border or having a clear-cut, explicit ideology of just exactly who should be American, who shouldn't be American. And that is the number one thing that woke me up, I suppose, in a sense of like, guys, worshiping the Constitution is destroying the country.
Yeah, they treat it like the Bible alone. I got my King James Bible and I got my Constitution. That's all I need. Well, the irony is that if you look at the history of what would become libertarianism, right? Negative liberty, as I mentioned earlier in political theory, this is a radically different conception of the state and its role than everything that came before it. So whether Catholic or Orthodox, one thing that both Roman Catholicism and its philosophy and Orthodoxy and its ethos agree on is that the role of the state was traditionally seen to be related to virtue and vice. Okay, so you already have a completely different paradigm by which the state basically restrains vice, and you could debate to what degree promotes virtue, right? So, and certainly many philosophers in the East and the West in the Christian tradition have debated to what degree the state should ban this or execute death for that, right? So, but what's common there is the assumption that the role of the state is as a minister of God, because Paul says that in Romans 13, to execute vengeance on evildoers. And that, of course, extends then into just war theory, which both East and West share. And then what you get, though, with the Enlightenment, the Protestant reformers, and negative liberty, well, maybe not the first generation Protestant reformers, because they actually believed in state churches as well, and Luther and Zwingli would actually persecute Anabaptists and have them killed. But the later generation reformers who would become Enlightenment individuals, they said no, the state is not there for promotion of virtue and forbidding or restraining vice. The state is there actually for the market. And the state is there to have a very limited role to allow the market to function. And again, read Kant's essay on world peace. And he says this is what's going to happen if we change our conception of the state, reorient everything to the market. And for Christianity, this is idolatry. And it's not an accident that the same people who were the sort of merchant class, banker class, noble class pushing for this Enlightenment ideology, this laissez-faire stuff, they were the same ones who I just lost my train of thought. They oppose the idea that the state has any other role than that, right? So all you get basically is debates about the minimizing role of the state. For most of them, you get some of the extremists in the communist Jacobin camp who think that the state's basically some radical, enforcement Committee for Public Safety murder machine, which is kind of what Bolshevism is, or just another version of that same same sort of Robespierre type view. But the point is that the irony is that all the revolutionary traditions are autistically idealistic. You know, these communists, they were the autists of 100, 200 years ago, because they think that the society should be smashed into some abstract ideal, like Plato's Republic, like the forms in Plato's ideal realm. And the irony is that monarchy is much more pragmatic and realistic, which is the very thing that they would criticize monarchy. You say, oh, you're an idealist. You have this idealistic conception. No, you're the freaking autistic weirdo with your Platonic idealism and your Robespierre Bolshevik idealism that you can smash everybody into this weird abstract, you know, equalized system. That doesn't work. And again, usury. Don't forget usury. This is a big part of this. That's what I was going to say. The same revolutionaries who were pushing laissez-faire, oh, well, magically, guess what? They just happen to be big proponents of usury, which Christendom forbade for the first 1,000 years. So that's not accidental. And it's not all the fault of Zionists or Talmudists. Guess what? The Vatican was the first institution in the West on a major scale to begin to allow usury. So I lay the feet at the popes, the Renaissance popes, who started saying, let's have usury. It's not that bad. It's okay. What does that lead to? Giant money lending institutions, giant banking houses, giant fraud institutions. And that's a big part of the corruption of the West.
I totally agree. You brought up this concept of negative liberty. I think that this is something that a lot of people don't understand. I want to make sure I'm using the proper term for this, but another big concept for me, the concept is negative liberty, the concept of libertarianism as just a negative ideology. It tells you what you are not allowed to do, but it does not tell you what you should do.
Right.
And when you accept, I mean, I don't want to get, I'm not as well read, of course, in religious topics as you are, not even close. But I think if you accept that there is a fallen or imperfect nature to man, mm-hmm. we kind of need to be told what to do to an extent. We need a purpose. We need to be told there needs to be an ideal that we strive for, both from a moral perspective, right, but also perhaps from a role in a society perspective. The concept of tradition, as an example, like your dad and your grandfather and your great grandfather, they were all warriors, right? Like it was known I believe, in the Soviet Union into Russia, people from the area of Georgia were known to be great warriors. Like you came from this area, you were good at fucking people up. This just simply was what it was. Mm-hmm. Intellectuals might have come from different areas, whatever. We need to have a tradition. We need to have something to take pride in and to follow in. And just this negative ideology of, well, everything you do is okay as long as it's not in the non-aggression principle. It doesn't really give us the structure that we need to succeed. And as liberalism collapses, we can't obviously fight this, like we said before, with let's just go back to 1776. Well, no, we need something that gives us purpose, something that gives us something to strive for, and it needs to be a hierarchical structure that we fit into and find our role that coincides with our natural abilities as people as well.
Yes, this has been lost in Western Christianity, especially in the last 500, 600,000 years, which is the role of the hero, saint, king, or warrior. I mean, you have many Orthodox kings who are saints and lauded and praised, songs sung about them, Serbian kings, for going to war against Islam. And that would be very advantageous if we understood that it's incumbent upon kings to be Orthodox and to defend their kingdoms for those principles. That's missing. That's gone. It's suppressed. You don't hear about the Serbian Orthodox kings who fought Islam. You don't hear about St. John of Kronstadt and his famous defenses of monarchy, and you don't hear about Metropolitan Philaret blessing the soldiers before they went to battle, and saying how virtuous and patriotic their actions were. That's all missing, and that's been lost because we're not supposed to believe that. We're not supposed to have that. That would empower us. That's what we would look to those saints, and we would emulate those saints who, again, were not just pacifistic guys, sitting up on a monastery. That's one way of living, but it's not the only way of living. There's all these other people who are models that we could look to as well, but that has all been suppressed and excised from the West. And yes, in Roman Catholicism, that was there for a long time, but the gradual degradation of Roman Catholicism also has lost that. They no longer talk about their crusade saints. They in fact suppress that. They don't, because it's not PC, it's not ecumenical. So really the only thing positive I see is that Russia is still not dead. It's still not completely destroyed. There is a resurgence of Orthodoxy in Russia for all of its problems. And as one of my friends said, it really looks like it's the Slavic peoples who will carry the faith into the future.
And ironically, I want to cut in on
and
this.
They'll have to re-evangelize the rest of the world.
I want to cut on this from kind of an alt-right perspective, which is it's the Slavic peoples that are the components of the white race that seem to be doing best in the face of globalism.
Yeah,
right. They've maintained their beliefs. I think without question. And your point, by the way, this is something I remember talking to my wife about shortly after we spoke for the first time back in May about the downplaying of like warrior saints, people that fought in the Crusades. It's something that makes, and this is maybe the wrong word to use, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's something that makes Christianity less cool to young men. This idea that we're only supposed to aspire to the saint that sits in a room and prays all day instead of someone who actively protects the faith and his people. And I think if we had a less cucked version of Christianity in the West, you'd see more people who were willing to embrace this ideology as something that could save their people because they could find a role for themselves within the hierarchical structure of the church. Because not everyone looks at this and says, I'm a dude that's going to sit down and take a vow of chastity or something and pray all day, right? Like there's different types of people that fulfill.
No, and this has been done on purpose. This is social engineering, and the social engineers know damn well that you remove strong patriarchal role models to destroy a society. And all the liberal church leaders are a bunch of cucks, and they're hypocrites because they know that that's part of their tradition, and they try to shy away from it, and they try to be ashamed of it, and when it's something they should be proud of. But they just show themselves to be frauds and hypocrites when they do that.
I think a great point about hierarchies as well is this idea, you think about the Declaration of Independence, and I think I saw a video of Richard Spencer talking about this, and he was correct. And even Jared Taylor will touch on this, but Taylor himself, I think, is oftentimes quite liberal in that he wants to have a white America that is in the vein of Jeffersonian beliefs or whatnot. But the line "all men are created equal" is just so antithetical to how we actually behave. And again, a big wake-up point for me is I've spent many, many years involved in athletics. I've competed in competitive powerlifting. I've competed in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, submission wrestling. And when you engage in actual competition, you realize very quickly that all men are not created equal. Right. This is.
I think every Bostonian. Are you like Boston or somewhere? Where you at?
I'm from New York. I'm from Long Island.
Oh, Long Island. Okay. Never mind. I thought I was thinking Boston, but they always talk about people being retarded.
Yeah. Well, listen.
And if everybody, so if they're always talking about retarded, then they know that some people aren't retarded. If some people are retarded and some people aren't retarded, then that shows you not all people are created equal.
Well, I'll tell you this. I grew up. I'm from Long Island, but I spent my entire family is from Queens. My mom's side of the family, my dad's side of the family. I went to high school and college in Queens, New York, and I consider myself to be more of a Queens goer than a Long Island kid, simply of where I grew up and who I spent my time with. And you had said this the first time we ever spoke, which was you can dislike the political system that you're from, you can dislike the traditions, but still not hate where you're from in a very local or geographical sense, where on the base level, people do kind of operate relatively independently from what's going on above them. Or they try to, at least. And listen, in old school, a less liberal, more kind of white New York, things were very different. Bostonians, and I lived in Boston for a little bit. Bostonians and New Yorkers are very, very similar. They can be quite nasty. They will ruthlessly tell you how it is. You know, a New Yorker is going to say retarded a little bit different than retarded, but they both understand exactly. So fundamentally, some people are you know, less better off than others, not just economically, but of course from a basic talent perspective. And the concept of hierarchies, again, competing in sports, there are some guys. I used to train with a guy who went on to be one of the best power lifters in the world. The guy, I mean, he squats almost close to 1,000 pounds without any supportive equipment. The guy's an absolute beast. Yeah, training with him right away, you know, you quickly realize, I'm not going to turn out like this guy. I could do well for me, but perhaps my lot is somewhere else in life. And we have to come to that realization instead of being disappointed with ourselves that we're not succeeding in an area that perhaps we were never supposed to succeed in to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure I could comment a whole lot on that, because I think it's so patently obvious to everybody who, you know, maybe if you never thought about it, you didn't notice hierarchies, or you didn't think about it, you weren't red pilled on the fact that not everybody's equal. But anybody who has thought about it for a moment or considered it, you know, Kobe Bryant is not the same in skill sets in basketball as a, you know, as a guy in a wheelchair. I mean, he's just not. You know what I mean?
As Christopher Reeve. Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
You know, Ricky Berwick or something cannot dunk on Kobe's head, right? And I think everybody knows this, so that's kind of like obvious that, you know, common sense that not everybody can do everything. And I think the same thing when you read, you know, ancient political theory, all the ancients understood all this commonsensical stuff. They understood that not everybody can do everything. Not everybody's fitted to do everything. St. Basil has a discussion of this where he talks about order in society, where he talks about classes, where he talks about kind of a lower, he uses the word slave. He doesn't mean it in a racial sense. He just simply means it in the Roman slave sense, in the sense of the people who were indentured servants basically for their whole life to families. And that was their lifestyle. That was how they were going to be. That's how the ancient medieval world conceived of things. And the disservice of modernity, which claims to want to lift everyone up, all it really does is, rather than have the ideal of exalting honor and virtue, it has displaced that with Homo economicus, right? As Spengler said, the idea of economic man being the highest thing that you could aspire to. What's the best thing you could be? A banker or a CEO? Well, actually, when you get down to the nitty gritty, I mean, there are some cases where people can start companies and it requires a lot of, you know, virtue and effort and amazing talent to become, you know, the creator of some company. That does happen at times. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but generally speaking, the typical path to being the CEO or to being the banker is just the most viperous, vicious, not virtuous individual, right? Mm-hmm. So in ways, yes, older warrior-based societies in certain ways did promote virtues that are superior to today's society. I definitely think that's true. That's a kind of Evelyn type, you know, Julius Evola type insight. Sure, I would agree with that. But yeah, now that we're in Homo economicus, now that we're in the idea of the highest virtue being, it doesn't even make any sense. What is the most successful individual? Is it the guy with the most fiat dollars? Is it the guy who, you know, has the most consumer goods? I mean, like, what does that even mean? Like, he's at the highest level of some viper company that's ruining, you know, species on the planet. Like, if I get to be the CEO of Monsanto, is that success? Well, meanwhile, I'm like just destroying species across the planet through genetic modification. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense. And so it's really just the promotion of psychopathy is all it is. Like the most psychopathic people, right? American Psycho type stuff. That's what it means to be successful. And that's what's so destructive. And pretty much all the universities essentially teach this, right? They teach the Milton Friedman, you know, greed is good, Ayn Rand type stuff. That's how you get ahead, right? That's what it is to win and that's radically different than anything, you know, in previous. And again, our forefathers are people in our traditions. Even Dante warns about the connection between usury and sodomy, and that usury can wreck a whole society. Even the ancients knew this.
You did a live stream a few months ago that I actually listened to yesterday, kind of getting ready to do the stream today, and you were touched on. I think it was Satan as the first classical liberal.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you said early in the stream that really stood with me, and as you're saying this, I have to say I feel the same way. Saying, you know, we live in this present day world where everything is inverted. You know, good is bad, men are women, women are men. It's just like a total freak show. And one of the things that's always kind of stuck with me, you know, as a young man or a boy, you know, 15 to 18, now being 32, 33 years old, is how what society tells me is successful, with the attributes or things that you must garner to be a dominant man are things that are actually not appealing to me. I agree with you. The idea that in order to be a high status male in my society means that I have to be a viperous, virtueless human being that just owns a bunch of Ferraris.
Like Jim Cramer on Wall Street, and like Jim Cramer has videos where he's like, I love Wall Street because it's the most social Darwinian thing. I just love crushing people. And I'm like, this is what you're supposed. This is the ideal, is to be this venomous psychopath. And yes, it is.
I agree.
It is.
Yeah. And I think that this concept, like you said, of usury penetrating the Roman Catholic Church, becoming unfortunately part of who we are, has without question inverted our morality. And you find that good men who want to do virtuous things like serve their community, right? Maybe serve their nation in a greater sense. And I don't just mean like going blowing things up in Syria, but just doing the right thing for the people in their area. They can't make a living. They can't actually go out and do what they want because the capitalistic system that's been pushed on us does not reward virtue the same way that it rewards usury and this awful, you know, viperous behavior. And we see this everywhere. We see this in
and this is a lot videos amongst the libertarians. Yeah, when I debated Robert Taylor, he was trying to make this dumb argument that, and I know because I once tried to make the same argument a long time ago that no, you see, capitalism promotes virtue because it means that you work hard and you have to be honest. And it's like, no, wait a minute, dude, come on. In argument, in theory, okay, but in the actual praxis, no. Everybody knows that the global system is not running on the basis of people operating virtuously and bankers operating honestly, because if they weren't honest, they would lose their good name. Yeah, maybe in 1940s, but did you see the bailouts, by the way? Like they were dishonest and they just got bailed out, and nobody has gotten in trouble to date, I don't think. Maybe Bernie Madoff, one fall guy gets in trouble.
Of course, that's always the case. It's always one fall guy, and then on top of that, that's where the libertarian ethos kind of falls, right? Which is like, well, you can go out and do whatever you want, but if you fail, it's on you, right? Like if you fail, you're the one who has to deal with it. But no, if you're a banker, you just get bailed out, right? I mean, this is one of the key flaws of libertarianism, or what Jones calls Whig economic theory, is that it was always about some bogus moral calculus. So what they actually mean by promoting virtue is some moral calculus nonsense, which if you actually just look into Bentham and look into moral calculus, you'll see how retarded it is, how stupid it is. Like you could literally come up with some way to calculate what gives the most pleasure to people or something. It's utter nonsense, but that's literally where their position was led to in the 1700s. This was dumb 300 years ago. So it's not any better now. They haven't gotten any better. And we see the fruits of it with the idea that, you know, the word it's bizarre because it takes on a very salvific quality where they want to save the whole world. They want to expand this ideology to the whole world, and this is what will save the whole world, which is not very liberal, by the way. So there's always this contradiction within liberalism that it on the one hand wants to be open-minded, wants to be open, but then demands that everyone accept this openness. And that was another great critique that Dugan has of liberalism, is this inherent contradiction, this dialectical tension that it has with itself about openness and tyranny at the exact same time.
So it's a fundamentally doublethink position, and you see it everywhere. You see it in the foreign policy, you see it across the board. And again, why do we want to spread Pepsi, Coke, and abortions to every country? I want to add too about fascism. Another example of this. I know that other people on the right will agree with me on this and are critical of this point, but not everybody is. And it illustrates one of the problems with so-called nationalism or national fascism, which is the Ukraine. If you look at how the Ukraine was supported by the State Department with Victoria Nuland and Soros's billions of dollars since the 90s to bring about the 2014 coup in Crimea, which was about severing Crimea from and splitting the Ukraine from Russian influence. That was intentionally done to a few years later, right now, in the last month, split the church in Ukraine, because a big part of the influence of Russia there was the Russian Orthodox Church. So what you saw with the splitting of the Ukraine, and it's important to understand that this was done through the support of the nationalism and the racial nationalism there. So even racial nationalism can be supported by the State Department and these NGO type groups, not because they believe it, but because they want to play the bigger geopolitical game. So anybody who thinks that you can like sidestep back to like the third position of fascism, something that's already come and gone, is really naive and doesn't understand power block politics, big scale geopolitics. This is why I often talk about the Anglo-American Atlanticist establishment, which is the UK, US, and Israel. That's what runs the world. That's the big power block, right? And they have the upper hand, and that's who organized all of this skullduggery in Ukraine. And they're trying now to do the exact same thing and force a split in Orthodoxy in America. They pretty much have already succeeded. So point being is that we can't just like fall back into thinking, let's go back to 1700s civic nationalism. Let's go back to 1930s fascism. Let's go back. You can't do that. Like, history doesn't work that way. And by the way, I'm not saying let's just go back to Byzantine Empire. Byzantium's gone, right? It's never coming back, right? I recognize that. You can't just like step back in a magical time machine. You know, Spengler talked about this, but you can bring about new forms. You can restore monarchies. The church can anoint someone to be a king. That's how it was always done. That can be done. It can't be done until the church, you know, thoroughly Christianizes an area. Certainly, we're not going to like force people into being in the church. It doesn't work that way. You evangelize first, and then, you know, same principle with Roman Empire, right? Like it's pagan, it persecutes Christianity for hundreds of years, then it converts. Then you have the Christian Imperium. So that's the model. That's how it goes down. And I was saying all that to admit that, yes, the same is true for monarchy. We've only been discussing it just in terms of forms of government, right? I'm not saying that let's go support the Gulf sheiks. Let's go support the United Arab Emirates.
I'm glad you brought that up, because people
the
think
monarchs
that
of
we were
Jordan,
saying that.
because they're all a bunch of CIA puppets, like literally. Like the King of Jordan has been a CIA asset since, like, you know, decades, long time. And there's not any single place that you're going to like set up some monarchy that's going to fight against, like, you know, the global imperium, which is the liberal imperium, which we have. That's you know, what we're talking about is way down the road. You know what I mean? Now, there actually isn't a movement in Russia to try to restore the Romanovs, which is an interesting idea. I don't know how successful that'll be, but you know, it's interesting that that's being kind of debated and bantered around. So it's not like there's a political solution. I don't want to give that impression. I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that, well, if we could just get a damn monarch in the White House. No, this is not anything retarded like that, dude. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I find it's an interesting point about the Romanovs. Two points. First thing is, when you look at the history of the Russian, or I'll say Bolshevik. I don't want to say, I hate the term Russian, because I think that Bolsheviks are very clearly not Russian. The history of the Bolshevik Revolution, what you find is, shortly after, you know, Operation Barbarossa commenced, Stalin started actually using like deeply Russian nationalistic terminology in an attempt to rally his people, because I think he even inherently knew that this concept of like a new nation and a new calendar that started the day that the Bolsheviks took over, That didn't really viscerally connect with his people. And kind of like we said before, in a weird way, even though the Soviet Union was not good, it did kind of protect a type of Russian nationalism, particularly in the post-World War II era, that did benefit them. And so, yes, it might seem ridiculous to someone who doesn't really know much about the history of the Bolsheviks or the Russians or World War II to say, man, why are these guys trying to bring the Romanovs back? Well, they did very much embrace Russian traditionalism, particularly towards the end of Stalin's life and well into Khrushchev, right? And so that's a very interesting kind of component of Russian culture that a lot of people are not keen to.
Yeah, they are, especially the people in the West or the traditional Catholics or the Cold Warriors. They tend to either ignore this or not know much about it. I am not an expert on this, but there is an interesting article by Kerry Bolton on this, about where he goes into depth in terms of Tragedy and Hope, Quigley, and he discusses how Stalin was opposed to the Atlanticist world order for at least some period of time, or that this did at least cause a kink in the armor. It was a problem in the world system. And this has been debated. So people debate this. Some people think, no, it was, Stalin was playing along the whole time. I don't have all the answers to that. But I would say that there is some truth to this. This is where you get National Bolshevism. I'm not saying that National Bolshevism is like some real thing that we need to adopt to go against, the Atlanticist empire or something. No, I don't think that, but there's some degree of I mean, this is why Stalin, has Trotsky killed. This is why the Mensheviks and the Trotskyites flee, because there's obviously some divergence here. There's some difference. And then the Trotskyites become the neocons, right? And they go to the Rand Corporation and they fight the Cold War against Stalin.
And they somehow become capitalists.
Exactly, because capitalism is revolutionary. Why not be? It's just as revolutionary as communism. So, but yes, and then you also have this gets really arcane into like some really deep Russian stuff that I'm not. I mean, it gets into like, there's a guy named Ustinov who's like the founder of National Bolshevism, and he tried to make alliances with the right in Russia. I think even some of the royalists, some of the white Russians, I don't think ultimately it was successful, but there was some kind of attempt to do this because they didn't want to, like you said, just even from a pragmatic standpoint, how are you going to get all these Russian people to not be Russians anymore? And that's kind of the driving force of international communism, is that you have to give up, who you are, supposedly. So it doesn't work very well, but it's great for destroying societies. And so in that regards, international Bolshevism destroyed a good bit of Russia. So yeah, I haven't totally figured out all the Stalin stuff yet. So I'm going to have to defer to those who know much more than I do, like Kerry Bolton's essay on it, or the interview that I did with Mark Hackard on Rothschilds supporting both MI6 and the Soviets. That's a very enlightening interview, because have you heard that, by the way? I highly recommend it.
I haven't heard it, but I will definitely listen to it.
I do think that because he translates a KGB colonel's diary, and a lot of people had for a long time suspected that Lord Victor Rothschild was aiding both sides, that he was feeding information to the Soviets and to MI6. Surprise, surprise, playing both sides. Can you believe it? No surprise. So shock.
Always
right?
the case, some would say.
Imagine my shock, right? Well, the KGB figured this out too, by the way. That's what's so fascinating about this. And when you understand the relationship of the state of Israel to this, and how Stalin's initial pro-Israeli policy eventually changed, and why then the state of Israel sided with the Atlanticists against Stalin, it starts to make sense in light of what you're talking about with National Bolshevism. So anyway, all of that is not to say that the NKVD was good. In fact, I think Ivan Ilyin has an essay on against the NKVD. So it's just not as usually as simple as we always want to make it. And so yeah, really neat stuff there.
That's the point to make. History is without question very murky, right? it's important when you look back at any historical figure to realize that these people oftentimes have great power. They make decisions that affect many things downstream, and they're going to make mistakes, right? There are you can look at certain things that Stalin did and say that's less bad than what I thought, but history without question is murky.
Well, one fascinating example of this is that the party outlawed homosexuality.
Yeah.
And at the same time as this, you had the CIA supporting the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the promotion of homosexuality. So who's good here? Well, it's not a question of good and bad. It's a question of, like one side is trying to paint themselves as the protectors and guardians of freedom, aka America and the CIA, and the other side is wanting to protect the idea of authority, right, which is the Soviet state.
All right, so we got a couple of questions here, Jay. One's a comment and one's a question. Someone is saying that what we were saying before about virtue and how things are kind of upside down in America, they're saying that it's false. They're saying being a banker means you can buy congressmen and push your political agenda. You promote virtue, say we promote virtues, meaning you and me, Jay. The left is seeking for power. In a democracy, the people with money are winning. This is how the system is designed. Now, before Jay tears into that, I'm going to say that's why we're seeking a different system. I don't really know what other answers there is to that, but Jay, do you want to take that for a second?
I don't even understand the objection. The objection is that bankers have power. Well,
I think there's a lot of people in the alt-right, and again, I sympathize with them in the sense I'm a white man. I want white people to continue to exist. I want there to be white countries, no question. But there is this tendency to try to, what I think is, it's to make white people become usurers in an attempt to control their own societies. And I think that we have to get away from that altogether as a means of constructing our society, if that makes sense.
Oh, I see. Like the kind of argument like, well, look, you got to get dirty to play dirty, to fight. You got to fight dirty to get in the game or whatever.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, again, I would say look at the history of Christianity. Look at the history of how the Imperium was Christianized. It wasn't done through skullduggery and usury. It was done through people being committed to their faith, being willing to die for it. And after, a few centuries of martyrs, the entire Imperium becomes Christian. So that's how it happens. And that at that point, really, it's just a question of a divergence between a worldview based around theology, based around orthodoxy, or a worldview that thinks that the way to do things is through skullduggery and trickery. And I mean, if you're going to go that route, and again, I'm not trying to be overly naive. I mean, I recognize that intelligence agencies have been in existence since the beginning of the world. I mean, they've been in every country. It's not about being naive and acting like, oh, we're going to set up a Puritan society where everybody's going to be virtuous. No, not at all. I mean, Byzantine intelligence and spying was notorious. So I'm very aware of that. So, Russia has had a long history of spying and intelligence as well. I was just reading, again, the famous Russian statesman's books. So yeah, we're not talking about being naive here or denying the fact that, societies, empires, civilizations, they require intelligence, they require military. And by the way, military intelligence actually should be under the military. I mean, that's what
I totally agree.
It's obvious. It makes most sense. It's really absurd that America transferred all of its intelligence, after, at the time of the OSS and the CIA to private things, right? So even though technically that's supposed to be under the purview of the government, actually it's basically the Rockefeller's private intelligence network is what the OSS and CIA were. And then eventually it becomes completely privatized. So yes, I mean, I'm more than willing to discuss the role of intelligence in civilization and geopolitics. But guess what? Most of the time, the level at which the discourse I would like to have is not the level of discourse that you and I are having. Most of the time, it's with freaking retards that don't even know that every society requires intelligence agencies. I mean, that's just a basic fact of how a society works. Why? Well, because all the other societies have intelligence agencies. That's why. So you have to have one. You have to have a military, right? You got to have a. So I understand the reality. I understand realpolitik, right? But again, thank you, by the way, for allowing me to have a conversation with a guy who is willing to at least ask higher level questions beyond we should have a free market. We should have a Bitcoin. As if that's all that's like this magical salvific power to Bitcoin, like it's going to save everybody. Anyway, there's no easy answers to that. I mean, I know that maybe I'm not giving the best answer, but there's not an easy answer to that kind of question, right? I mean, to what degree, there's just not an easy answer to that. I mean, those answers will come when we have repaired more fundamental things. So, by the way, it's also a very Americanist idea for people to say, "What's your solution? What's the solution?"
Well, that's what's getting dropped in the chat, by the way. So if you want to take that,
my solution is orthodoxy. It's existed in history and it's built giant empires. You got anything better? What are you going to give me? Mussolini? Sorry, dude, that's dead. That's come and gone. That's not going to work. You're not going to have Mussolini the sequel like set up or whatever. Anyway, so that's my answer to that. By the way, I mean, this is the more you get into history, the more you see that this kind of stuff, there's precedence for this in history. Like there's already been situations where people were put into positions where they had to try to figure out whether, take something fascinating like assassinations. Is there a biblical basis for assassinations? I would say yes. I would say there is a biblical basis for that. It certainly happened in the history of the church. We've seen it in the Bible. That would be a fascinating conversation to have in a civilization where we already had Christianity established, but we don't have that. So we can't talk about that really. I mean, ask that in 100 years when there's a Christian civilization.
I agree. Now, someone was asking, did we miss the conspiracy talk? Well, I had one conspiracy that I wanted to bring up to Jay that I think would be a great thing to maybe close this down on a little bit.
Sure.
Jay, it's got to be back over the summer. I was listening to Boiler Room. You were on Boiler Room one night, as you often are, and you had brought up the moon landings. And I want to bring up the moon landings because about 2 weeks ago, my buddy Josh and I, every Friday, we started kind of reviewing a film that we like. We go over the symbolism and it kind of what you do, but maybe not as refined. We talk about bands that we grew up liking or whatever. And the first one we did, we were discussing Rocky, and there was some question in the chat asking about, if the media is if the Hollywood establishment is so anti-American, so anti-white, which I think it's obvious that they are, although again, what does being American mean? They are without question anti-white. How do you rationalize the fact that they put out First Man that celebrates the great accomplishment of a man landing on the moon? And so to bring this kind of back to you, you had referenced, was it Wag the Moondoggie by Dave McGowan, I believe. And so I sat down and I read the whole thing in one day because, first of all, it's very well written stuff, Wag the Moondoggie.
And it's funny, too.
It's funny as hell. The guy is really, really funny. And the moon landings, they're more important than you would think. You'll get some people that will say, I don't want to engage in a conversation about the moon landings. It's childish. It doesn't matter. And one of the first things that I thought about while I was reading McGowan's work is we are often told that the moon landings represent the greatest triumph of capitalism over communism, right?
Absolutely.
That the moon landings represent the epitome of Western superiority over Eastern intellect or whatever.
It was essential to the Cold War. Absolutely. Exactly.
And the moon landings have become part of the Americanist religion in many senses, right?
Oh, yeah.
And there's a couple interesting notes to this, which is if you accept that is true, which I don't believe that we landed on the moon, and we'll go into that in just 1 second. But if you accept that is true, then if you do an iota of research, then you have to accept that the Nazis, who are inherently, apparently anti-American, got us there because we're told that Werner von Braun designed the Saturn V rocket. Right?
Isn't that an interesting little little trick there.
Yeah, that's the first thing. But the second thing is, so that's already the contradiction within the moon landings. It's totally retarded. But then on top of that, if you think to yourself, okay, the moon landings didn't happen, which I think we have every reason to believe that they were all staged. Well, then it really makes you wonder, how important is economic ideology to the accomplishments of a civilization? We were told the communists didn't land on the moon because they didn't have capitalism. But if we can look at this from an actual critical sense and say, well, it looks like the Russian space program was actually far superior to ours in almost every sense of the word, that means that there actually is something more to a people than merely economic ideology. And that's why when people say, well, don't talk about the moon landings, it doesn't make sense, I say no, because what is real? We were told the only reason we made it there was because we had capitalism. It's retarded. It's retarded. If we didn't make it there, then what made the Russian program more successful? There's obviously something deeper that invokes success within a people than just more capitalism.
Right. Yeah. I don't have any fear. I've taken a lot of flack for being a moon skeptic. And by the way, I'm not a flat earther. I don't think that the planets are fake or anything like that. But I do consider it well within my epistemic rights to be skeptical of the very prominent examples of supposedly going to the moon. Now, beyond that, I think it's up for debate. I think that you can debate what degree, advanced aircraft exist or don't exist, or what kinds of satellite technologies out there. I don't think satellites are fake. But I think that the argumentation that we're given for the moon landing is pretty brilliantly deconstructed by Dave. And I want to add that I didn't ever take that conspiracy theory seriously until I read Dave's book. I mean, I was always open because I consider myself, open to hearing any kind of argument. I'll listen to people who make, like the arguments that we live in a simulation, and well, this is just Plato again, right? But I'll hear it out because it's fun to entertain or kind of play a like a mental kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Hypothetical. Like let's say that this is true, then blah blah blah. But I remember that when I first, this is one of the conspiracies that you first encounter. Like if you were back, Googling in 2004 or 5, you have conspiracy theories and the moon landing, right? And you get like it's fake, or you get no, there's actually, alien monoliths on Mars.
Those are the two. Those are the two big ones.
Like that's exactly the two options. And I never paid attention to either one of them, although I did entertain the possibility of like, okay, well, maybe there's moon monoliths on Mars or whatever. And the reason I didn't really consider the stage moon landing stuff plausible was that most of the debates devolved into just the most, idiotic, like hyper fixation on the flag and like the shadow of the flag. And I'm like, this doesn't prove anything. So I never really paid much attention after that. And separate from that, when I was studying in grad school psychological warfare, you're kind of shocked or taken aback at the level of deception that goes on in warfare. So you'll learn about situations where, allied powers, Axis powers, did some very big league deceptions. And a lot of them are funny. A lot of them are very fascinating, during wartime, like dropping giant inflatable tanks, which are not real, but that looked real to the Axis powers. So it freaked them out. This was a famous incident of a bunch of inflatable tanks that were not real. Dropping flyers that talked about how news clippings at home were describing how soldiers, this was done to the Axis powers. I'm trying to remember who did it, but they somehow they tried to drop news clippings from what were supposed to be, I think, German papers at home about how all the soldiers' wives were leaving them because they've been gone for so long. And what it was supposed to do was like destroy their morale. So, how can you go fight when you're worried that, Greta back home is, screwing some other guy? So you start to notice that this is like all the time in warfare, dude. Like there's nothing but constant deception. Then when you study media and you realize the prevalence of deception in media, we have been talking about fake. I'm not saying Trump got this from us, but I mean, the people that I've been doing podcasts with for years have been talking about fake news. We've been talking about staged events, skepticism about events, not making dogmatic pronouncements one way or the other, but asking questions. And so when I finally came to back to the moon issue, maybe 4 years ago, somebody said, "Hey, read Dave's book." So I read, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, and Dave had a lot of really strong arguments about, Hollywood and the music industry and social engineering, which I've talked about a lot. So I thought, well, he's pretty good here. I'll check out his moon book. I'll at least give the guy, a hearing. I don't really have an opinion one way or the other. I could see, it being staged, but at the same time, I don't want to be a freaking retard. You know what I mean? So anyway, long story short, I know I'm rambling, but yeah, I read Dave's book, and to me, he asked so many really pertinent questions that when you look into it, you don't see people answering. You don't see solid answers to pretty basic questions, and things like contradictions that in the claims of the astronauts themselves. Like they have really contradictory accounts of what happened, what went down. The ergonomics of the dune buggy, and there's so many things like that. The impractical nature of 230,000 miles in a tiny tin can, which, I mean, I drove with my girlfriend 5,000 miles in a Prius, and that was a nightmare. So the idea that you could do this, 240,000 miles in this, even smaller tin can, to me is pretty preposterous. And then when you couple it with the big scale psyops of the Cold War, I would say, for me, the argument is much stronger for them being staged, especially when you look at Apollo 13, they're fucking playing golf. Give me a break, dude. Your life is on the line. The slightest thing that could go wrong would kill the whole team. It would be a disaster, but you're such a badass American that you're going to go up on the moon and play fucking golf. Give me a break. No, once you start thinking about it like that, you start to realize, dude, this is an obvious fucking psyop.
There's also the component. This is another thing that, again, there's so many. Society will structure these things in a way where you are socially ostracized if you don't accept certain beliefs as dogma. And so when that happens, you sometimes won't look deeper into things because you don't want to be ostracized. Kind of getting back to our discussion before about how democracy can be really demonizing and make you feel lonely when you think everyone else thinks something differently than you, right? When supposedly socially you give the state legitimacy.
Right.
So you're looking, for example, at these guys, they were up. Listen, I'm not saying that they weren't real astronauts, right? As an example. So you see the photographs of like Neil Armstrong or Buzz Aldrin from other missions when they're getting out of like the capsule, when they've landed like back on Earth, like just shot back into Earth in a parachute. And they look like shit, as anyone would look like shit when they've been not showering for days in a tin can flying around the planet, But for some reason, when these guys get popped out of the capsule that lands back on Earth after the moon missions, they look great. I mean, their hair is done. They're perfectly clean shaven.
Yeah, it's because it was a photo op.
Yeah, it's just totally ridiculous. Like you can't tell me.
I don't doubt low Earth orbit. Yeah, exactly. I don't doubt that astronauts were in low Earth orbit or that Sputnik did that. I mean, I do doubt though that they went 240,000 miles one way and 240,000 miles back with that little rinky-dink tin can. And by the way, I went to the DC museum a few years ago, the Aerospace Museum, where they have, I can't remember if it's an exact replica or it's the actual, Apollo craft or whatever. It's one of the two. And the funny thing about it was that everyone standing around me, very busy that day at the museum, everyone around me was literally snickering and laughing and like joking about like, how did they really fly this dinky thing? It looks like something from a B movie. Literally everyone just sort of chuckling and laughing about it. And I couldn't help but think that, I mean, this is kind of like, I mean, cell phones can barely send signals, life on Earth, but we're supposed to think that they were beaming this shit, back, 240,000 miles away with like 60s technology. Yeah, give me a break. No, it's much more plausible to me that it was filmed on a soundstage. I don't know where. I don't know that Kubrick did it, maybe, but who knows. And by the way, I believe there is a secret space program. I believe that NASA, a lot of what NASA has been there to do was to operate as a front, as a kind of PR propaganda front. And what was really going on, and by the way, Dave came to the same conclusion, independent of me. I didn't know he believed this until he mentions it in his book. He says that really what they were doing was essentially erecting the giant global surveillance grid. They were essentially putting into place the internet, all this kind of Skynet type surveillance throughout this period where we're supposed to think it's about conquering the moon and all this kind of crap, all this propaganda. And really all that did was operate as a front for the real deep state, the real space program, which is, like stuff operated by the Navy and DARPA, not freaking NASA. That's the real program. And they absolutely installed a giant Skynet surveillance system that is now operative. It's going into effect. It's called the Internet of Things, right? It'll probably be called Skynet, right? That's all very real. And that's what was really going on. So I'm rambling, but
no, I totally agree with you. That's there obviously was a secretive end to what they were trying to accomplish. Whenever you get
right.
that the cover story, be it the Gulf of Tonkin incident or whatever, there's always a cover behind that.
By the way, supposedly it doesn't matter. They say, oh, we've learned everything, so why don't we go back? Why have we not been back to the moon? And, oh, it's because well, there's nothing there. There's nothing. That's literally what they say. It's like, oh yeah, we pretty much got all the facts. It's just dust. No reason to go back. And then you're like, well, and how do we know that we went? Oh, well, NASA actually lost all the footage, by the way. Did you know that?
Oh yeah, they lost back in the 70s. They lost like
sorry,
thousands of
most important event in human history. Sorry, we lost all that. Oops, sorry. I mean, who believes this fucking shit? But most people, by the way, they don't know about all these crazy claims, and then you go look it up, and it's like, this is nonsense. I can't believe that there's this much nonsense. But by the way, one reason that I don't have a problem entertaining those positions and then looking into them is because I know how paradigms and worldviews work. So I don't believe Darwinism. I don't believe in purely natural selection. I mean, there's an aspect to which natural selection is true, certainly, but I don't believe in the sort of the scientism and the Darwinian mythology. Because I see it as another example of this kind of wide-scale propaganda that people don't actually know why Darwinism is true. When you really start reading it, when you really start looking into what is a mythology, essentially, you see how easily it breaks down. So for me, it's not that difficult when you understand how easy it is to convince large numbers of people of untrue, preposterous things. I mean, just look at the idiocy of what the normal political discourse is. I mean, most people believe in the Democratic Republican nonsense. They believe they live in a democracy. They believe the news. And we on, the dissident right, we on alt whatever, alt left even, we know that stuff's not true, right? Yet we can see that giant swaths of masses believe it. So I don't feel at odds or weird questioning Darwinism, nor questioning this silly looking moon stuff.
You really touched on something great, which is reconsidering everything. Sometimes I think about one of the worst components of Trumpism. And I'm not saying that like a guy like Alex Jones had all the answers or whatever, but I do find it interesting that the Trump candidacy, the Trump presidency, effectively got people like Alex Jones and Mark Dice to suddenly re-believe in the system again. It's fascinating to me how all those kind of alternative voices are now like Republicans.
9/11 was a big event for me, which is similar to these kinds of big scale deceptions. Like I view Darwinism, the moon, and 9/11 as great examples of like large scale deceptions where people's views on those topics generally have absolutely nothing to do with their own research, but rather for most people, it tends to be just repeated news nuggets or repeated stuff from mainline academia, or at least like if they went to the university, they're rehashing Darwinism because their professor told them, which is, again, has nothing to do with actually proving that whether it's true or false, right? It's just a kind of basic appeal to authority. It was, well, my professor said that blah, 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 blah. 11 million years ago, the monkey got down from the tree, as if anybody fucking knows what happened 11 million years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's the same with 9/11. I bring up 9/11 because, what you're talking about with sort of getting reinvested in the political system. I don't think I could ever be reinvested in the political system here because it was around the time of 9/11 that I was reading about monarchy. Like that was right when I started reading like the first monarchy books, monarchist works, and I was really just questioning the secular deistic American ethos. And right at the same time, you have this very catalyzing, giant so-called terror event, which, not within a year or two of researching, for me, I was convinced was an inside job. So yeah, I mean, it's like, once you see how people can be easily swayed with an event like 9/11, it's similar to the way people form their beliefs about Darwin, similar to the way they form their beliefs about the moon or anything. You see the exact same thing with the stupidity of the political system, and it's no different. So I mean, to be reinvested in the stupidity of the political system would essentially be to like step back into the Matrix or something. Like, oh, well, I guess Osama bin Laden really wasn't a CIA asset, and he really was like a threat, even though like a year before he was a hero, or not a year before, but like, in the 80s, he was a hero of the Mujahideen.
Of course, Ben Laden was working closely with Rambo in Rambo 3.
Exactly. By the way, I think I put this in Esoteric Hollywood too, but I tweeted about it a while back, a few months ago, but I had forgotten that if you watch The Living Daylights, even as late as like 87, Timothy Dalton is James Bond teaming up with bin Laden.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I always joke around with my friends, like, watching Rambo 3 now is hilarious. It's like
that's the other one. That's the other one. You're right. Yeah, I forgot Rambo has him with Mujahideen too, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's like, it's so funny. It's like, wait, but now they're the bad guys? What does this even really mean? It's totally ridiculous. All right, Jay, I got one last question for you, and then we'll head on out. This is a question that I, of course, cannot handle, but you can. Tammy Elisa asks, Mr. J. Dyer, Protestants are obnoxiously anti-tradition like liberals. How do I respond to Protestants who shriek about throwing away the traditions of men?
Okay, well, this is a really simple one. The first thing I would say is that you can't take the sole statement about Jesus against the Pharisees as a blanket statement against tradition, because there's many places where Jesus actually affirms tradition. So, for example, if you look at Matthew 23, I think 1 through 4 or 5, you'll see that Jesus actually affirms tradition because he says that the scribes and the Pharisees sit in the seat of Moses, and he says to listen to what they say, but don't do as they do, because they're hypocrites. He says they don't do what they say. He says, but they are the recognized religious authority. Now, I bring that up because there's no such thing in the Bible as a seat of Moses by which the scribes and Pharisees had succession from Moses. So this is a tradition. Jesus affirms this tradition, and it's one of the reasons why in the church we also have that same tradition. So that's just one example from Jesus affirming oral extra biblical tradition. There are plenty of examples of this. In fact, I actually have an essay, an apologetic essay that you could read at Jay's Analysis called The Biblical Defense of Tradition. So if you look that up at Jay's Analysis, it'll come up, and I have a whole bunch of other examples. Another one that's very clear, especially for Protestants, I remember this struck me back when I was a Protestant, is in 2 Thessalonians, where Paul says to the church at Thessalonica, he says, be sure to keep the traditions that are delivered to you, whether oral or written. So very, very clear, very unmistakable, precise injunction from St. Paul to keep both the written texts and the oral traditions that he delivered. So those are two examples, but if you read my essay, there's a bunch more.
That's great. And again, that's way outside the scope of my expertise. As again, I'm trying to get more in touch with some of these teachings of Christianity to kind of figure out where I can get involved back again as a Christian potentially. Because like I said before, Catholicism definitely alienated me from it. But as I read more about Orthodoxy, I find something that I could definitely find identity with. So I do appreciate that answer, Jay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and let me see here. I was going to quote so this is 2 Thessalonians 2:15. Paul says, "Therefore, brethren, stand fast and hold to the traditions that you were taught, whether by word or by our epistle." So both oral and written texts. And what happened with Protestantism, of course, was that they attempted to essentially jettison the idea that there's also a tradition that comes down from the apostles, embodied in the church's liturgy, embodied in her saints, embodied in her feast days, the calendar, and so forth. The Protestantism basically said, let's get rid of all that and just get back to the so-called Bible. But the thing about the Bible is that the Bible isn't a thing that functions on its own. It was compiled by the church. It's a book that came together over the process, many centuries in the early church. So the church even preceded the Bible, right? So when the apostles go out and found churches, there's many churches that had pieces of the Bible. They might have had, one gospel and 3 of Paul's epistles in the Old Testament. So that the church existed even before, centuries later into the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, when there was a compilation of a basically final canon.
So again, this is
that completely destroys Protestantism, by the way.
Okay, interesting. Thank you so much, Jay. So guys, listen, I got to be honest. I'm running out of steam. I got to get going. I want to thank Jay so much for coming on tonight.
Yeah, dude. My pleasure. It was a great talk.
On the off chance that you're not subscribed to Jay on YouTube or you're not following him on Twitter, all of his social media links are down below. You could find the link to his book, Esoteric Hollywood, also in the description. I really can't recommend highly enough that you follow Jay's stuff, because Jay's a guy who has had the chance to study a lot of the things that we're discussing on a higher level. For those of us that have jobs, own businesses, have children, it's not feasible for us to go and study these things at the university level. And perhaps there's an argument to be made that,
well, you got a badass fucking bookshelf behind you, dude. So I don't know why you can't.
Well, I'm working on it. These are actually my grandfather's books. I inherited this from him after he passed away about a year and a half ago. So I'm working on it one book at a time. That much I can promise you. But if you are also stuck in your car a lot, Jay's lectures are the way to go, particularly if you want to learn about the globalist, his globalist lecture series on tragedy and hope, the Anglo-American establishment. These are really must listens if you want to know your enemy. I cannot emphasize that enough.
Appreciate it.
So follow Jay, jaysanalysis.com. And if you go to Jay's Analysis, don't be a cheap son of a bitch. It's not that much to get access to all of his private stuff. Donate to his Patreon, throw the guy some money. I view Jay as an intellectual in this, as Alex Jones would say, in the info war, folks. This guy is a phenomenal intellectual in the info war. So follow Jay, throw Jay some money, do what you got to do to support him, because from Jay's knowledge, you're getting channels like myself and other people who are using him as a means to learn a lot more. So that's all I got to say. This is probably the best stream we ever did. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Jay, do you have anything you want to close it out with?
No, man. Thanks a lot. And look for Esoteric Hollywood 2. It'll be out in December. And again, thank you for you're way too kind. Just thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. Great talk.
Jay, it's all good, my man. Guys, have a great night.
All right. God bless, man. Later.
Take it easy, Jay.